Chapter 2096. Now, this group of palaces had turned into an indescribably mysterious formation. All the palaces were the nodes of this formation. A mysterious power was constantly circulating within it, faintly seeming to be brewing some kind of unimaginably mysterious thing. This change quickly attracted Luo Fan's attention. With a thought, everything in this group of palaces was directly reflected in his mind. The changes contained in these palaces that he hadn't given them when he first constructed them were continuously picked out by him, and began to gather and reconstruct them. When he first constructed this group of palaces, he didn't give them too many mysteries. It was just that 100 years ago, when he raised this group of palaces above the entire group of heavens and earth, so that he could directly look down on this endless world, this group of palaces naturally resonated with this group of heavens and earth. Naturally, it changed along with him. In this way, it was very clear that the mysteries that this group of palaces now possessed, and which weren't given by Luo Fan back then, were some kind of manifestation of the mysteries contained within this group of heavens and earth. In other words, by comprehending these mysteries, he would naturally be able to comprehend the deeper mysteries of this group of heavens and earth from a macroscopic perspective. Unfortunately, at present, this group of palaces was still in the process of being perfected. Although the deeper mysteries contained within were faintly discernible, they were ultimately still incomplete, so it was difficult for them to truly take shape. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan wanted to gain something, he would need to expend an unimaginably great amount of energy. If there was no other way, and he could only wait for him to comprehend and reveal the mysteries within, then he could only bite the bullet and forcefully gnaw at this formation. However, it was very clear that the current situation wasn't limited to just this. As long as he waited for his imprint to completely imprint all of the heavens and earth within this group of heavens and earth, and completely refine the entire group of heavens and earth, then this formation would naturally become complete. At that time, the mysteries would be completely revealed, and the difficulty of comprehending it would be billions of times lower. Under such circumstances, how could he possibly comprehend the mysteries of this formation at this time? Naturally, they would have to wait until the formation was complete. As thoughts flashed in his mind, Luo Fan threw the formation formed by the palaces to the back of his mind and continued to immerse himself in comprehending the countless views of the world reflected in the sky. Time passed slowly, and no one knew how much time had passed. An inexplicable tremor suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's heart. This tremor directly broke his originally leisurely cultivation, causing him to have no choice but to wake up with a frown. Looking up at the sky, the entire sky was already bright. The process of the stars increasing in the sky and the process of the dark starry sky being illuminated had completely stopped. This seemed to mean that he had completely refined the entire heaven and earth group. However, Luo Fan could clearly see that there was still a shadow in the sky. Like a nail, it was stuck somewhere in the sky, making him unable to be truly perfect, unable to completely refine everything in the entire sky. This nail was located at the edge of the valley, which was also the edge of the heaven and earth group. That place has already been refined by another cultivator. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. For him, if it was a world without an owner, there would be no problem for him to refine it. But now, this process of refining and spreading showed no signs of wavering at all. In fact, there was even a faint rebound effect on the area that he had already refined. This situation, no matter how he looked at it, seemed like that part of the area was being refined. Who is it? As he frowned slightly, his eyes narrowed, and the sky began to change continuously. The darkness that originally occupied a very small area began to expand continuously. In the end, it turned into a scene that covered the entire sky and appeared above the palaces. This was obviously him using the higher-level characteristics of the palaces to shift his vision. This situation was like standing on a tall building and looking down at the ground. As long as one had a telescope, they would naturally be able to magnify the area below and quickly zoom in, allowing them to see it clearly. That area looked extremely small in the entire sky, and even the size of a thumb was an exaggeration. However, after magnifying it, one would find that the amount of heaven and earth contained in this area could only be calculated in the hundreds of millions. One could imagine just how vast it was. Changing the angle of view slightly, the original darkness had already turned into its true appearance. Every part of the heaven and earth flickered with an indescribable faint golden light. It was like stars that constantly flickered in the sky. Vaguely, the light in every part of the heaven and earth seemed to have some kind of subtle rhythm. It seemed to be continuously passing, faintly forming an indescribable whole. Is he thinking? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and this thought flashed in his mind. With this thought, his angle of view changed slightly, and he saw that the area had turned into a huge humanoid figure. This humanoid figure was lying in the void at this moment, in an extremely comfortable and relaxed posture. As it breathed, it seemed like the endless heaven and earth were breathing at the same time. This figure's face was rather blurry, and one could tell that it was a young man. However, one could not see what exactly he looked like. At this moment, the moment Luo Fan looked at him, the figure trembled slightly, and his eyelids slowly opened. As he opened his eyelids, from another perspective, the speed at which the faint golden light flickered suddenly increased by more than 100 times. The light in every part of the heaven and earth seemed to have suddenly been activated, and they flickered almost continuously. In this way, the area that was originally dark in his eyes suddenly became extremely dazzling, as if it had turned into a sun in the sky. And from the perspective of this figure lying on the ground, he saw a pair of eyes full of infinite wisdom and intelligence appear under his eyelids. Then, the pair of eyes began to roll around, and a blank look appeared in those eyes. "Who's spying on me?" He turned for a while, and such a voice came out of his mouth. This voice spread to the entire heaven and earth through the connection between the heaven and earth, and in the blink of an eye, it had already swept through the heaven and earth, and even directly entered into Luo Fan's ears. This voice was not sent into his ears by his perception of the heaven and earth, but directly passed through the infinite distance, directly to where the palace was located, and directly into his ears. Not bad, this is already the strength to fly to the 4th level. At this moment, Luo Fan had already understood in his heart. The cultivator in front of him was naturally extremely powerful, but his own strength could not be used in the 3rd level of the Tao Master's Road, so naturally there was no need to say more. Before he displayed his extraordinary skills, even Luo Fan could not see the level of his extraordinary power, so he could not measure how strong he was in the first place. But now, although he only opened his mouth to send out a voice, but there was a trace of extraordinary principles revealed in it, so he clearly knew the level of the other party's extraordinary power. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and in a flash, he had already arrived in front of the area. Then, with a thought, the endless heaven and earth around him trembled slightly, and an indescribable wave directly emitted from these heaven and earth, and brazenly surged toward the heaven and earth area in front of him with a faint golden light. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept through hundreds of millions of heaven and earth in this area. As this inexplicable wave swept through this heaven and earth, specks of golden spiritual light constantly flew out of this heaven and earth, and at this moment, at an unimaginable speed, constantly gathered in front of Luo Fan at this moment. In just a few short breaths, these lights had already condensed into a figure. This figure looked like the figure that he had seen lying on the ground from a different perspective. It was a young man. At this moment, the young man looked at Luo Fan with eyes full of shock and vigilance. "What do you mean, Taoist friend? I'm cultivating here, why do you want to disturb me?" After appearing, he directly spoke. Although the level of extraordinary power that he could exert was incomparable to that of Luo Fan, at this moment, he was not nervous at all. However, at this moment, he was not nervous at all. Facing Luo Fan, He was full of confidence. It was as if his own strength was comparable to that of Luo Fan, and Luo Fan could not do anything to him at all. The reason for this change was very simple. It was nothing more than that he could ascend at any time. No matter how strong Luo Fan was, even if he was so strong that he could kill him in an instant, he could at any time touch the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path and ascend to the 4th level of the Tao Master's path. As long as Luo Fan did not have the strength to surpass the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path, it was impossible for him to interrupt and attack him when he touched the ascension rules. With such confidence, how could he be nervous when facing Luo Fan? How could he not have the confidence to face Luo Fan? Of course, in addition to this, perhaps, he had more confidence, for example, his relationship with the Tao Master's disciples. Luo Fan stood there quietly, looking indifferent, and said, "Taoist friend, you're blocking the way." Blocking the way? I've been cultivating here for hundreds of thousands of years, and I haven't seen you for such a long time. If you want to talk about blocking the way, it should be you who is blocking my way," the young man said with a displeased expression. Naturally, Luo Fan was not in the mood to talk to him about the order of arrival. In the cultivation world, no matter what level it was, the law of the jungle was inevitable. As long as one was strong enough, being unreasonable would become reasonable. If one was not strong enough, being reasonable would become unreasonable. Therefore, at this time, he just said indifferently, "This place is very important to me, please move to another place to cultivate. Judging from your cultivation method, you don't necessarily have to cultivate here." The young cultivator frowned deeply and said, "Taoist friend, you want me to move away from the place where I've cultivated for hundreds of thousands of years just by talking nonsense? That's too much. Actually, I've already given you a lot of face by not attacking you directly." Luo Fan was not moved at this time, and his expression did not change much. Hearing this, the cultivator's expression changed slightly. He did not know exactly how powerful Luo Fan was. However, he knew that the cultivator in front of him was much more powerful than him. When such an existence was unreasonable, there was really nothing he could do at this moment. He just said indifferently, "Taoist friend, have you thought it through? Although I'm not a disciple of the Tao Sovereign, I'm still a disciple of the Tao Sovereign. If you insist on forcing me, I'm afraid you won't be able to bear the consequences." Luo Fan sighed and said, "I originally saw that you placed your soul on the world to cultivate, and I thought you were quite extraordinary, but I didn't expect you to be like this. What a pity, what a pity." The young man naturally knew what Luo Fan meant. It was nothing more than saying that he placed his foundation on his identity, that he had gone astray, and that he had no future. However, he obviously had a different opinion. At this time, he did not care about what Luo Fan said, nor did he have any intention of arguing. He waved his hand and said, "Since you are prepared to bear the consequences, then I'll let you have this place." At that moment, he turned around and took a step. His figure had already disappeared in front of Luo Fan, and he quickly headed out of this group of lands. Looking at his speed, it was even faster than his own fastest speed. It was obvious that although he appeared to be very calm in front of Luo Fan, in fact, he was still wary of Luo Fan's cultivation, and was still worried that Luo Fan would go back on his word and attack him. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He did not care much about the life of the cultivator in front of him. As for the serious consequences that the cultivator said, he did not take it to heart. He could not be clearer about what kind of existence the Tao Master's disciples were. However, no matter how strong the Tao Master's disciples were, he would not be wary of them. After all, his goal was to see a true divine. If he even had to be wary of the disciples of a true divine, how could he become a true divine? Therefore, he did not want to offend the Tao Master's disciples for no reason, lest it would cause trouble and affect his cultivation. But he would never choose to surrender when trouble came to him, and it was even more impossible for him to choose to retreat when he had to face the Tao Master's disciples. Therefore, it could be said that the worry of the cultivator in front of him when he left was obviously just a worry for him. As the Tao Master left this group of worlds, the connection between him and this area was almost completely cut off, and the repulsive effect of this area on his forge the universe began to weaken. After all, the Tao Master's method of refining this area was different from that of Luo Fan. In fact, his refining could even be said to be just a side effect. It was a side effect of his own cultivation method. His cultivation method was to disperse his own soul into the many worlds, operating with the operation of the world, and reincarnating with the reincarnation of the world. Through such changes, he could absorb endless nutrients and strengthen himself. Under such circumstances, although he did not have the mind to refine these worlds, as the reincarnation of the world continued, and as the many worlds flowed, his imprint would naturally penetrate into those worlds, and finally achieve the effect of refining these worlds. Under such circumstances, when he was forced to take back the soul fragment by Luo Fan, it actually meant that the effect of his refining of these worlds was extremely weakened, and when he was far away from this area and the group of worlds, the originally faint connection would be completely cut off, and eventually become invisible, causing this large area to completely return to its original state of no owner. It was precisely because of this that the current situation happened. "Let's begin, the last region," Luo Fan murmured. He raised his hand and pointed forward. Behind him, the numerous worlds that he had refined began to release indescribable fluctuations. They constantly gathered and rose. Finally, they turned into a surging torrent that surged towards the worlds in front of him. In front of this torrent, those worlds were like ice cubes that were directly devoured, shattered, fused, and turned into a part of the torrent. They continued to move forward, and continued to devour, shatter, and fuse more and more ice cubes. In this way, under the surging torrent, more and more worlds were imprinted with his imprint. As more and more worlds in this area were refined by him like the other worlds, he faintly felt an inexplicable sense of perfection gradually emerging in his heart. It was as if a cocoon had begun to appear in his heart, and it began to expand and shrink, beating and slowly maturing, slowly moving towards the ultimate transformation. Under this inexplicable feeling, Luo Fan couldn't help but be immersed in it. His expression began to become somewhat inexplicable. Originally, he could have let go of the refinement of the world, but now he was personally controlling all the changes, manipulating the torrent to constantly advance and wash away. Time continued to pass. 1 day, 2 days. Chapter 2098. The slate in Luo Fan's hand, which was completely transformed from the entire valley, was none other than the embryonic form of a grand heaven and earth. At this moment, the concept was constantly changing and combining. It could turn into a complete grand heaven and earth at any time, and finally materialize into a complete grand heaven and earth. Of course, this was just a trend. Although it seemed to be a good trend, Luo Fan was quite clear that all of this was just a reflection in the mirror. No matter how perfect the development of the world was and how perfect the combination was, in the end it could only be close to the grand heaven and earth, but it could not really become a grand heaven and earth. This was not a logical deduction of fact. It was just a fact that he deduced based on the nature of the Tao Master's path. After all, the Tao Master's path was just some kind of creation built by the Tao Master or true saint in the grand heaven and earth. And the existence of true saint was also an existence that cultivated in the grand heaven and earth. Such an existence might be able to create a perfect world and cultivate a world at the level of the grand heaven and earth, but it would not be easy. In other words, even if it could be done, it would definitely take endless energy and even a great price to achieve it. How could such an existence, no matter how generous the Tao Master was, be placed on the third level of the Tao Master's path? How could it be so easily obtained by him? That's right. Although Luo Fan felt that it was extremely difficult and took a lot of effort to refine all the worlds in the entire valley, in fact, in retrospect, the whole process was extremely smooth after all. It could almost be regarded as a process without any twists and turns. Such a process was far from the harvest of the grand heaven and earth. With such a deduction, one could naturally know that the slate in his hand would not eventually grow into a real grand heaven and earth. In other words, the world view that seemed to be able to turn into a complete grand heaven and earth at any time was already the limit of the slate's evolution. Even if it waited for billions of years, it would never become a real grand heaven and earth. Of course, this did not mean that the slate had no meaning. On the contrary, the significance of such a slate to him was even more significant than the real grand heaven and earth. After all, the heavens and the earth were too perfect, and the various laws and laws within it were too deep and too difficult to understand. Even if it was placed right in front of him and controlled by him, it would be very difficult for him to gain anything from it. In comparison, this ever-changing scene that seemed to be able to transform into the world view of the great heaven and earth at any moment revealed even more of the mysteries of the great heaven and earth, allowing him to comprehend even more of the mysteries of the world view that was close to the level of the great heaven and earth. For him, it was much easier for him to get what he wanted. Originally, when I heard from my disciple that a fellow Taoist had forced him to leave his place of cultivation, I secretly thought that it was too overbearing. Now that I look at you, I have to thank you for showing mercy. The Tao sovereign's disciple wore an indescribable expression. The foundation of the Tao represented the foundation of the Tao and the hope of achieving the Tao. Any cultivator would be willing to abandon everything and destroy everything in order to obtain it. If someone stood in the way of a cultivator obtaining the foundation of the Tao, then no matter what that cultivator did, it would be understood by other cultivators. Under such circumstances, since he knew that the valley was a certain kind of foundation of the Tao, he was naturally not surprised that his disciple had been chased away. In fact, if he was the one doing it, it would not be as simple as chasing away the disciple. He would definitely act without any scruples and completely erase all traces of the disciple's existence to prevent the fact that he had obtained the foundation of the Tao from being leaked. From this point of view, it was not ridiculous for him to thank Luo Fan. When Luo Fan heard this, his heart moved slightly and he said, "It seems that fellow Taoist is planning to act." He was not a naive person. The disciple of the Tao Master said this because he clearly believed that if others knew that he had the foundation of the Tao, they would definitely come to snatch it without any scruples. Therefore, if someone stood in his way, he should kill them to silence them. And it was obvious that the disciple of the Tao Master in front of him already knew about it. The disciple only smiled and said, "I think fellow Taoist can understand. After all, this item is too precious. If you obtain it, it is almost equivalent to a Tao Master teaching you day in and day out. This kind of temptation is too great. Even if you are a disciple of a Tao Master, you will definitely not give it up." Hearing this, Luo Fan understood. Indeed, what the disciple of the Tao Master said was indeed the same kind of item as the one in his hand. The endless ideas and worldviews in the slate in his hand were constantly changing and combining, as if they were trying to turn into a complete worldview of the great heaven and earth. This situation was almost like a Taoist master or a true sage trying to reconstruct and combine some ideas into a worldview of the great heaven and earth. Although the final result was almost impossible to succeed, the thought process, key combinations, and construction methods all contained extremely profound principles. To any cultivator who wanted to become a true divine, it was naturally like a true divine teaching them how to combine ideas step by step. In fact, it was precisely because of this that this item was considered as the foundation of the Tao. Of course, this was only Luo Fan's current understanding of this item. There must be more mysteries hidden in this item, but it would require him to spend time and energy to comprehend it. Now that he had just obtained this item, it was naturally difficult for him to know, however, no matter what mysteries there were in the depths of this item, just the mysteries that it displayed were enough for him to not give up even if he had to face the challenge of a Tao Master's disciple. At this moment, he said indifferently, "Perhaps, fellow Taoist can give it a try." The disciple of the Tao Master sighed and said, "Sure enough, it is impossible for fellow Taoist to surrender." As he spoke, a ray of light suddenly shot up into the sky from his body and suddenly dispersed in the void. In a flash, it had already completely enveloped a radius of 10,000 miles. The radius of 10,000 miles was not too big for existences at their level, and could even be considered narrow. However, in the third level of the Tao Master's path, an area of this size was already an area that only extremely powerful experts could completely control. In this world, the appearance of a barrier of this size would at most tell others that there were experts fighting here and warn others not to approach or offend them. This was also the most suitable barrier to isolate this location from the battle. After all, to normal cultivators, an expert who could create such a formation was not someone they could fight against. Naturally, they would not approach or probe the formation. To the true powerhouses, such as pseudo-saint level existences, a barrier of this size was so fragile that they couldn't be bothered with it at all. For such a barrier to appear here, it was like two ants drawing a circle to form a duel field for a duel. Naturally, they would not have any interest in probing. It was not that this Tao Master's disciple could not cast a stronger and larger barrier. However, once a stronger barrier was cast, ordinary cultivators would not be able to affect it and observe the battle that was about to take place inside. However, at the same time, it would definitely attract the attention of true experts, causing them to cast their gazes over. Once the true experts cast their gazes over, no matter how strong the barrier was, it would not be able to truly block all the experts. At that time, the battle between Luo Fan and the Tao Master's disciple inside the barrier would naturally be completely seen by other experts. The reason for the battle and the Tao Foundation in Luo Fan's hands would definitely be leaked. This was obviously something that the Tao Master's disciple could not accept. It was precisely because of this that the Tao Master's disciple had only set up such a barrier with a radius of 10,000 miles to firmly envelop the battlefield between the two of them. As soon as Luo Fan saw this barrier, he naturally knew what the Tao Master's disciple was thinking. His heart trembled slightly, and he had a further understanding of the value of the Tao Foundation. Even the Tao Master's disciple had such a profound scheme for this item. This Tao Foundation was probably even more precious than he had imagined. At this moment, the Tao Master's disciple's expression became extremely ugly. Faintly, an indescribable fear appeared in his eyes. With a single glance, Luo Fan knew what he was worried about and what he was afraid of. "It seems that if fellow cultivator obtains the Tao Foundation, you'll probably directly kill me to silence me, right?" Luo Fan said with a smile. Hearing this, the Tao Master's disciple smiled slightly. He turned his head and glanced at the Tao Master's disciple. "Kill me to silence me? That's naturally not necessary. I am the Tao Master's disciple, so obtaining the Tao Foundation is extremely normal. If I truly obtain it, no matter how much others want it, they won't be able to snatch it from my hands. Naturally, there's no need to keep it a secret." Hearing this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. Indeed, he was wrong about this. The Tao Master's disciple had not set up this barrier to completely conceal the existence of the Tao Foundation. It was just to conceal its existence before he could snatch it. After all, he was the Tao Master's disciple. This kind of identity was enough to protect the existence of the Tao Foundation. The other cultivators that could threaten him were all disciples of the Tao Masters, so there was still some kinship between them. Under such circumstances, unless the Tao Master's disciples completely disregarded everything, it was unlikely that they would directly snatch it. In this way, it was obvious that the Tao Master's disciples only needed to be on guard against the time when he discovered the Tao Foundation, but it hadn't fallen into his hands yet. After all, during this period of time, the Tao Foundation still didn't belong to him. No matter how much the other Tao Master's disciples were worried, they definitely wouldn't hesitate to make a move at this time. If fellow cultivator doesn't have the confidence to protect this item, perhaps breaking this barrier is also a good choice. The Tao Master's disciple smiled at Luo Fan. Luo Fan only smiled when he heard this. Perhaps this will be my last choice. Of course, he was just joking. He definitely didn't lack confidence. Just as he said this, the Tao Master's disciple had already made his move. He raised his hand and pointed at the void. A mysterious concept had already rushed out from his hand. With a slight tremble in the void, it was unknown how many near-perfect worlds were gathered around the concept. It turned into a long river and rushed straight towards Luo Fan. This Tao concept was mixed with the boundless heaven and earth. Just its power alone had the power to destroy the heavens and earth. Not to mention that at this moment the numerous heavens and the earth were being reconstructed according to various profound methods under the control of that concept. They protected and stimulated each other, and the might they erupted with was countless times more formidable than it was in the past. It could be said that at this moment, even if the world was in front of it, it would most likely be destroyed within a radius of millions of miles. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan didn't even frown. With a wave of his hand, a wave of law power directly turned into an area of nothingness in front of him. As it expanded and contracted, it had already devoured the concept along with the endless world. In the next moment, the endless worlds were completely destroyed. Even the concept was completely crushed at this moment and combined with the fragments of the world, forming a sticky state. It was obvious that the Tao Sovereign's disciple had already expected that this move would fail. At this time, a light shout was issued from his mouth, and the surrounding heaven and earth naturally dispersed endless law fragments. They condensed in the void and turned into a big hand. It directly broke through the glue-like area and directly grabbed towards Luo Fan. It seemed that Luo Fan was about to be caught in the middle of that big hand. At this moment, Luo Fan's law power had just been restrained by the exchange just now, but it had stagnated for a trillionth of a second. For a moment it seemed that it was difficult for him to condense an effective resistance. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart flashed with admiration. He raised his hand and pointed at the void. An imperishable concept rushed out from his hand. It transformed in the void and condensed into a human figure. This figure rushed straight towards the huge palm. This figure was almost identical to his body, and it looked like an incarnation of him. However, this incarnation's hands were constantly forming an incomparably familiar seal, the indestructible seal. In the process of rushing over, countless concepts were naturally derived. They naturally twisted and changed, turning into countless illusory figures. They gathered in one place and formed a long river. They poured into the huge hand in front of him and directly drowned it. The power of the huge hand itself was clearly not something that those illusory figures could resist. In the process, it constantly changed various forms. As its power surged, countless illusory figures were completely shattered with each move. However, in the end, the difference between the number of illusory figures and the huge hand was still too great. Even if the countless phantoms were destroyed at every moment, in the end, the giant hand still stopped in the middle of the phantoms. Immediately after, the figure formed by the indestructible will had already charged into the giant hand. With a slight sway, it had already destroyed the endless law fragments, allowing the most fundamental power contained in the giant hand to truly appear. This most fundamental power was a wonderful concept. In other words, it was a kind of condensation formed by a combination of a concept and a power that Luo Fan had never seen before. To be more precise, it was a combination of that strange concept, a power that was condensed by unknown number of special powers in some unimaginable way. This is similar to a divine sense. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if a vast world had suddenly opened up in front of him. He only felt that endless light was constantly shining in his heart. The most fundamental core power of this palm was obviously a special way of using a concept. This way of using a concept was beyond Luo Fan's imagination. It also surpassed all the methods of using concept that he had comprehended in the second level of the road to Tao Master. This method was already close to a divine sense formed by a concept as the core. The concept change contained in this divine ability was so complicated that it was unimaginable. Under this change, the effect of the concept was unleashed to a level that was unimaginable to him in the past. If it was calculated in multiples, his use of the concept could unleash tens of times, or at most hundreds of times, the power. After the Tao Master's disciple used the method that was close to a divine sense, the use of the concept could exert at least hundreds of thousands or even tens of millions of times the power of the concept. That was almost an earth-shaking change. Just as all these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, the divine sense of concept had already slightly shaken and directly collapsed the imperishable concept. Then, under the control of the Tao Master's disciple, it brazenly pounced on Luo Fan. At this moment, no matter how many thoughts and inspirations Luo Fan had in his mind, he had no choice but to wholeheartedly focus on this battle. With a thought, the imperishable concept had already appeared behind the divine sense of concept. With another blast, it directly shattered the palm that was about to form again. Then, he grabbed the divine sense of concept with one hand. As the imperishable seal changed, an unknown amount of power turned into strands and poured into the divine sense of concept. It began to attack the power inside the divine sense in a variety of indescribably complex ways, disintegrating the structure of the divine sense of concept. For Luo Fan, the only thing that could stop him was the unknown. Chapter 2099. Just like the concept ability at this very moment. This was the first time he had encountered such a concept ability. Before this, he had never thought that a concept ability could be used in such a way, and that it could unleash such an unbelievable power. However, after recognizing the root of the concept ability's transformation, the supreme power that it could unleash was already traceable in his eyes. And when it became traceable, the weakness naturally became as clear as the lines on his palm. As a result, with just a thought, the various powers had already seeped into the concept divine ability, directly separating the concept divine ability and the other powers from the inside. As the connection was separated, the many powers that were originally united by the concept ability suddenly became chaotic at this moment. Endless power was wildly released, instantly crushing the palm of light that was taking shape. Terrifying shockwaves scattered in all directions, and in the blink of an eye, the spacetime within a radius of 10,000 miles had been completely destroyed. Of course, it was only within a radius of 10,000 miles. When they reached the spirit formation that was 10,000 miles away, the various ripples and impacts naturally disappeared. Not a single one of them leaked onto the spirit formation. In fact, the spirit formation did not even tremble. This situation was clearly the result of Luo Fan's special control. If he had not specially restricted the fluctuations, let alone most of the shock waves sweeping out, just a trace of their power would have been enough to completely destroy the boundary that only covered a radius of 10,000 miles. As for the reason why he made this choice, there was naturally no need to explain. The Tao Sovereign's disciple would be wary of other cultivators, and would not want other cultivators to know that there was a Tao foundation here. Naturally, he would not be so arrogant to the point of being unscrupulous. Perhaps, if he were to do it himself, he might not have set up the spirit formation because it was too troublesome. However, since the spirit formation had already been set up, he would not waste any effort to destroy its existence. This could be said to be the tacit understanding between Luo Fan and the Tao Sovereign's disciple. The Tao Master's disciple's expression became extremely ugly at this moment. The concept theurgy that he used was imparted to him by the Tao Master. Although it was not an invincible theurgy, generally speaking, only the concept theurgy that could resist this theurgy. But just now, the rogue cultivator that he looked down on had already shattered his god art the first time they met, causing the power contained in his god art to explode. This situation was simply a provocation to his own pillar of support. How could his expression not change? "Where did you get this inheritance?" the disciple of the Tao Master asked. As he spoke, the shock waves and chaos caused by the explosion of his concept god ability had completely recovered under the circulation of the laws of this world. The surroundings became clear once again, as if nothing had happened. As for the Tao Master, he was completely dumbfounded at this moment. In his eyes, the disciples of the Tao Master were almost invincible. In his eyes, only the disciples of the Tao Master could fight with the disciples of the Tao Master. But at this time, right in front of him, the rogue cultivator was actually on par with the disciple of the invincible Tao Master in his eyes. This kind of strength, this kind of means, simply subverted his views, making him feel that many of the views he had accumulated in the past seemed to have been completely overturned. As for the previous shock waves, they were naturally not a threat to him. After all, he was the disciple of the Tao Master. He was also a powerful cultivator who could cultivate to the 4th level of the Tao Master's path from the 3rd level. For him, it was not a problem to resist the aftermath of this battle. "Strictly speaking, it can be said that I obtained the inheritance from fellow Taoist," Luo Fan said with a faint smile. At this moment, his heart was filled with countless inspirations. All kinds of ways to use ideas and ways to combine ideas and power kept emerging from his heart, making him feel that he had accumulated a strong desire to fight. At this time, he really did not want to entangle with the disciple of the Tao Master in front of him. At this moment, the disciple of the Tao Master sneered and said, "Looks like you don't want to say it. Never mind, no matter what, I will not give up on the foundation of the Tao. Where you obtained the inheritance is just a small matter." He immediately raised his hand and pointed at Luo Fan. In an instant, a ray of spiritual light shot out from his hand and constantly distorted in the void, turning into a figure with 3 heads and 6 arms. As if it had transcended time and space, it directly arrived in front of Luo Fan and blasted towards him. This figure with 3 heads and 6 arms was also formed by a concept god ability. The changes in power contained in this concept god ability were more numerous and more complex than the previous palm. The concept within it was also more resolute and purer. It could be said that if the previous disciple of the Tao Master had only attacked casually, then this attack could be said to be absolutely serious. The difference in power between the two was so great that it was almost a 100-fold difference. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The immortal concept that had been scattered before shook slightly and naturally condensed again, blocking in front of the concept god ability with 3 heads and 6 arms. Immediately afterwards, the boundless power in the surroundings began to condense into strands and strands, condensing towards the indestructible concept. It quickly wove and changed inside and outside the indestructible concept, gradually combining into an unimaginable form, unleashing a power that surpassed the indestructible concept by thousands of times. In just an instant, a kind of aura that exceeded the limits of the immortal concept burst out from the immortal concept and swept in all directions. Even the boundary with a radius of thousands of miles shook slightly under this aura. The expression of the Tao Master changed greatly under this aura, and he kept retreating. In the blink of an eye, he retreated to the edge of the boundary, as if he would rush out of the barrier and leave the battlefield in the next moment. This wasn't because the Tao Master was timid. Rather, this aura was too powerful and targeted. In the face of this aura, An existence like him felt as if he was being targeted by a natural enemy. If he didn't avoid it, this aura alone would be enough to penetrate into his heart and leave an indelible mark on his soul, forming an unimaginable shadow. Crude! The Tao Master's disciple shouted faintly. Under his control, the concept God ability with 3 heads and 6 arms directly distorted the surrounding time and space, instantly shattering the rules and laws. This caused the many near-perfect worlds contained within to release an unimaginable power in the process, lingering around the concept God ability. The 6 arms of the concept God ability, along with the concept God ability, blasted towards the immortal concept in an extremely exquisite and mysterious way. The most important characteristic of the immortal concept was its indestructibility. As long as the core of the concept existed, no matter how many blows it experienced, no matter how powerful the attack, it could always condense again and never dissipate. And obviously, the core of the immortal concept was Luo Fan. In other words, as long as Luo Fan existed, as long as he wanted, the immortal concept could exist forever. No matter how many times it was shattered, no matter how thoroughly it was crushed, it could always be restored under his control. At this moment, in the face of the attack of the concept God ability, the various powers and rules that lingered around the immortal concept were immediately crushed. Then, even the immortal concept itself was crushed at the same time, turning into countless fragments that flew in all directions. It's really too crude. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Then, the immortal concept condensed again, once again condensing in front of the concept God ability with 3 heads and 6 arms, turning into a figure. However, this figure seemed to be wearing a suit of armor at this time, looking much more majestic than before. This armor was none other than the condensation of various powers in a special way. The way this power was condensed with the indestructible concept was even tighter and more intricate than before. The power that it could unleash was also dozens of times greater than the indestructible concept. Evidently, he had already made some improvements to it. Fortunately, although the collapse of the immortal concept did not really resist the concept God ability, it still affected the concept God ability, causing its crushing speed to be slightly slowed down. This gave him the opportunity to condense the immortal concept again to resist the concept God ability. The expression of the Tao Master's disciple changed slightly. The immortal concept was obviously still just a concept, and had not really condensed into a divine ability. However, from the structure of the concept this time and the previous structure, he could already feel how incredible the speed of improvement of the opponent in front of him had reached. It could be said that although this concept was still inferior to his concept God art, as long as he used it a few more times, as long as the improvement wasn't too great, then it would definitely be able to reach a level comparable to his concept God art. When that time came, his biggest advantage would probably turn into a bubble. After understanding this, how could the Tao Master's disciple not be anxious? At this moment, he no longer hesitated. He raised his hand and pointed again, and another concept God ability rushed out of his hand, turning into a giant Kuan Ping beast, directly pouncing towards Luo Fan. In the face of this new concept God ability, Luo Fan did not panic. On the contrary, his eyes slightly lit up, as if he had seen the change that he had been dreaming of. Following that, another concept shot out from his body. This was also an immortal concept. Moreover, this immortal concept also turned into an immortal seal, and Luo Fan directly rushed towards the concept God ability that looked like a Kuan Ping beast. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived before the concept God ability, and clashed with it. The Tao Master's disciple did not stop moving. Different concept God abilities were launched one after another, covering the sky and covering the earth, towards Luo Fan. At the same time, Luo Fan's response was similar. Similarly, one immortal concept after another turned into a human figure, and clashed with the concept God abilities that had appeared. In this way, it seemed like the area around Luo Fan had suddenly turned into a beast battlefield. In the blink of an eye, the originally spacious area became extremely crowded. The battle between the concept god abilities and the immortal concept was even more tragic, shocking ordinary cultivators. The battle scene could even be said to be one-sided. No matter what the concept god ability looked like, no matter how big or small it was, its power was bound to be beyond the level of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of levels of power contained in the concept itself. In this way, in the face of such an impact, even if Luo Fan's own immortal concept had been tempered by the second level of the Tao Master's path and strengthened countless times, it was still difficult to resist. In that battle, the immortal concept was almost broken up and condensed again and again. It looked like a suicidal way to resist the concept god abilities. Resist the concept god abilities. However, in this seemingly one-sided battle scene, the expressions of Luo Fan and the Tao Master's disciple were completely opposite of the battle situation on the surface. The Tao Master's disciple, who should have been proud, had a dignified look on his face, as if he was at a disadvantage at this time. In contrast, Luo Fan, who should have been grief-stricken, looked quite calm and composed. There was even a faint trace of joy on his face at this time. How can it be so fast? At this time, in the Tao Master's disciple's mind, this was the only thought that appeared at this time. From the start of the battle until now, for several days and nights, this was the thought that had appeared in his mind the most at every moment of every moment, because the speed of his opponent's progress was really too fast. In the beginning, what he displayed was a simple combination of the concept and the power. Until now, in just a few days, it had actually grown to the level of the prototype of the concept god ability. It could be said that now, although he could still crush the opponent's concept, the power needed to do so was already hundreds of times more than before. He even had to replenish the consumption of the concept god ability at every moment. How could he not be shocked by such a strange change? How could he not be shocked by the enlightenment of the rogue cultivator in front of him? At this moment, the status of the foundation of Tao that urged him to attack had unknowingly decreased in his heart. On the contrary, the idea of subduing the rogue cultivator in front of him and cutting off his path of cultivation kept rising in his heart. Of course, this was not because of jealousy, but because he and the rogue cultivator were now in a position of hostility. Although the conflict between the two was not completely irresolvable, it had become extremely difficult to deal with. If he waited for the rogue cultivator to grow to a height that he could not resist, then it was very likely that he would be killed by the rogue cultivator. With this change of mind, his original view of the disciple that he was quite fond of had unknowingly changed. Indistinctly, an inexplicable feeling of displeasure and resentment began to appear in his heart. If this trash did not come to me to complain, I would not have encountered such a difficult opponent now, compared to the various complicated thoughts in the Tao Master's disciple's mind. At this time, there was only indescribable joy in Luo Fan's heart. The countless combination and construction methods of the concept of immortality and power were constantly revolving in his heart. A more and more profound, complex and mysterious construction method began to gradually perfect in the depths of his heart. Faintly, he felt that the kind of concept of immortality that he was looking forward to, the kind of concept of immortality that could exert the power of the concept of immortality to the limit, was about to take shape compared to the Tao Master's disciple's displeasure at the Tao Master's disciple. He unknowingly felt inexplicable gratitude towards the Tao Master's disciple. After all, if it was not for the existence of the Tao Master's disciple, how could he compete with the Tao Master's disciple in front of him? How could he see such a concept god ability? If he could not see such a concept god ability, he would probably have to wait for hundreds of millions of years before he could really understand this method of controlling the concept of immortality, in other words, because of the Tao Master's disciple, it was very likely that he could save hundreds of millions of years. How could he not involuntarily feel grateful towards the Tao Master's disciple? Both of them were existences whose thoughts could already affect the operation of the rule of the outside world. The changes in their perception of the Tao Master's disciple naturally triggered some subtle changes, which made the Tao Master standing at the edge of the bounded domain feel his body tighten, as if something bad was about to happen. However, at this moment, he did not care about all this at all. At this time, he had already wholeheartedly devoted himself to the battle between Luo Fan and the Tao Master's disciple. Although it was the Tao Master's disciple, he still had not mastered such a mysterious method as the concept God ability. In other words, now it could be said that it was the first time that he really saw the various subtle changes of the concept God ability, and also saw a kind of concept God ability being established from nothing. Chapter 2100. On this day, the disciple of the Tao Master who was fighting with Luo Fan trembled slightly, and his expression suddenly became extremely nervous. Tao concepts suddenly surged out of his body and condensed into a shield in the void, directly blocking in front of him. Phoenix Novels. The moment the shield condensed from his concept appeared, a strong wave instantly swept through everything around him and collided with the shield. In an instant, the shield exploded, and a terrifying impact was released, rushing towards the disciple of the Tao Master who was behind the shield. At this moment, the countless different types of concept abilities that the disciple of the Tao Master had previously sent out had completely collapsed under this wave, turning into countless concepts and strands of power that were billions of times more than the concept. They mixed together as if they had turned into a paste. Behind the paste, an indescribable power began to move the paste, causing it to start sweeping in all directions. The barrier that spanned 10,000 kilometers was instantly torn to shreds. Even the power, abilities, and thoughts that formed the barrier were torn to shreds in an instant. They surged out in all directions along with the glue-like existence. These changes rushed out for several light years before gradually calming down. By the time everything within a radius of several light years had completely calmed down, everything within the range seemed to have undergone a thorough cleansing, exuding an indescribable sense of purity from the inside out. Such a huge change was naturally insignificant on the scale of the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. However, on the scale of a cultivator, this was a terrifying change that would definitely shake the world. The reason for that was because only existences whose strength was close to or even surpassed the pseudo-saint stage could trigger such an abnormality. And in the third level of the Tao Master's path, as long as one's strength reached the false saint stage, they would naturally be able to ascend and leave this level. In this way, how could anyone who could sense the change in this location not be curious about what was happening here? How could they not be curious about why existences who could already ascend would stay here to engage in such a tragic battle? Thus, at this moment, countless senses gathered from all directions. In an instant, they swept through the entire battlefield, inside and out. At this moment, the disciple of the Tao Master did not care about the other senses at all. At this moment, his eyes were focused on his opponent in front of him. "You actually succeeded," he said in disbelief. At this moment, in his eyes, Luo Fan was surrounded by an extremely familiar aura. It was an aura that belonged to a concept ability. This aura pushed away all the chaos in the surroundings and constantly stirred the surroundings, causing the chaos to become even more chaotic. In this situation, even a fool would know that Luo Fan, who had not grasped the concept ability before, had already obtained it. Combined with his previous performances, he naturally knew that in just a few days, this rogue cultivator in front of him had already created a concept ability that belonged to him from scratch. How could this Tao Master's disciple, who had spent millions of years to learn this concept ability, balance it? "You actually did it." He looked at Luo Fan with an extremely shocked expression. Even his words had become incoherent. At this moment, Luo Fan did not care about the Tao Master's disciple, nor did he care about the many senses that were spreading towards him from all directions, wanting to completely grasp everything about him. He only focused on comprehending the indestructible concept ability that he had just created. This ability was still rather crude, and there was still countless room for improvement. However, it had already reached the standard of a god ability. Once it was used, it would be able to stimulate the power of the concept of immortality to an effect that was more than 100,000 times greater than normal. That terrifying degree made even him, who had reached this step, feel inexplicably shocked. As for why this concept ability was only rather crude, but it was already able to easily shatter the many concept abilities of the Tao Sovereign and completely erase all of his opponent's defensive methods, the reason was even simpler. It was precisely because his concept itself was already indescribably powerful. If compared to the concept grasped by the Tao Sovereign's disciple, the power of his indestructible concept was at least 100 times stronger than the other party's concept. In this way, when the other party used the concept ability, it would multiply his own concept. In the end, the power of the concept would be at least 100 times stronger than Luo Fan's concept ability. Only then would it be possible to suppress Luo Fan's indestructible concept ability. Obviously, although Luo Fan's concept ability was crude, it was clearly not weaker than the other party's concept ability by 100 times. At the very least, the power in Luo Fan's hands could not be weaker than the power of the concept ability in the other party's hands by 100 times. As a result, the one-sided change from before naturally occurred. If it wasn't for Fellow's demonstration, I'm afraid it would have taken me tens of millions of years to establish this ability. After a long while, Luo Fan sighed and said to the Tao Sovereign's disciple. His words were like a slap to the face to the Tao Sovereign's disciple. This is your own ability, it has nothing to do with me. Since Fellow's strength has already grown to this point, I believe you should be able to keep your foundation. I won't do anything else. Goodbye. He said indifferently. As he spoke, he waved his hand, ignoring the Tao Sovereign who was left with half of his body and could not recover. He turned around and left. When Luo Fan heard this, he naturally knew that the Tao Sovereign had said this on purpose. After all, there were many senses surrounding him at this moment. The owners of those senses would not be any weaker than him in terms of the foundation of Tao. The Tao Sovereign had said all this before he left because he wanted the owners of those senses to make a move against him. This kind of sneaky trick is really unbefitting of Fellow, Luo Fan said indifferently. As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped towards the Tao Sovereign's disciple. He was not the kind of person who would remain silent after suffering a loss. Since the other party had schemed against him before he left, how could he just let him go? No matter what, he had to leave behind something to remember. As he slapped out, a mysterious light shot out from his hand and turned into a huge palm in the void. It arrived behind the Tao Sovereign's disciple in a manner that transcended time and space, crushing towards his body. The profound light contained an extremely strong aura of indestructibility. It existed in a place of its own, and everything in its surroundings was incompatible with the profound light. It was as if the profound light was all-encompassing, and it could find everything in the universe. Of course, this was only what outsiders felt. In Luo Fan's senses, the mysterious light was even more detailed. Not only could he sense the advantage of the mysterious light, but he could also sense the various dryness and imperfections between the concept of indestructibility and the power within the mysterious light. After slapping out with his palm, he felt a little dissatisfied. In the end, it's only the beginning. If I want to make it complete, I still need to carefully polish it. At this moment, such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, countless rays of light were released from the Tao Sovereign's disciple's body, forming a light barrier behind him. This light barrier was also condensed from a concept ability, and there was a powerful aura that belonged to a concept within it. The concept God art collided with the palm forcefully. An earth-shattering rumble sounded out, and a terrifying impact spread out in all directions with the point of contact as the center. The surrounding spacetime and laws were completely shattered at this moment. Layers of even more profound laws appeared in the surroundings at this moment. Under the impact, the laws in the deeper layers were constantly shaking. Although they didn't completely collapse, the shaking alone was enough to show how terrifying the impact was. After all, these laws were originally hidden in the depths of the void, and it was impossible to find them. Now, not only had they been found, but they had also completely manifested and started to shake. It went without saying how intense the impact was. The result of this impact was obvious, and Luo Fan emerged victorious. After all, the Tao Sovereign's disciples' all-out attack previously could not withstand his indestructibility concept ability. Now that his opponent was in a defensive position, although it was not considered a hasty attack, how could it be compared to a full-powered attack? It was obvious that failure was inevitable. The Tao Sovereign's disciple's face was filled with disbelief at this moment. He did not expect Luo Fan to make a move at this moment. One must know that he was the Tao Sovereign's disciple, and his status was a supreme existence that was millions of times more noble than a lone cultivator. He had merely schemed against Yi Futian, but Yi Futian did not just endure it, but actually dared to make a move. While he was in disbelief, an unparalleled force blasted his body and instantly shattered it into countless pieces that flew in all directions. Furthermore, during this process, there were still waves of energy lingering above the fragments, constantly battering at them, trying to break them into even finer pieces. As expected of the Tao Sovereign's disciple, he has too many life-saving methods. Luo Fan sighed to himself at this moment. The Tao Sovereign's disciple seemed to have been smashed into pieces, as if he could not be more dead, but in fact it was only a superficial wound. Although his physical body had been destroyed, his life source and concept of existence were not affected at all. With the strength of the Tao Sovereign's disciple, he could naturally recover completely with just a thought. It was as if time had been reversed, and he was not injured at all. At this moment, several figures came across the sky and appeared not far away from the two of them, looking at them from afar. These figures all had a very familiar aura on them that Luo Fan was very familiar with. That was the aura of the Tao Sovereign's disciples. Obviously, these figures were all the Tao Sovereign's disciples. I didn't expect that a lone cultivator would be able to obtain the foundation of achieving the Tao. This is a treasure that even our Tao Sovereign's disciples cannot obtain. A Tao Sovereign's disciple laughed, and said to the other Tao Sovereign's disciples not far away, "That's right, that's right. As expected, cultivation luck is really subtle and unpredictable. Even we can't grasp it." Another Tao Sovereign's disciple laughed and said. At this moment, the other Tao Sovereign's disciples also laughed, and the atmosphere seemed to be quite relaxed. It was as if a few good friends were sitting around the table and talking loudly. This attitude of completely ignoring Luo Fan vividly displayed their own arrogance, causing Luo Fan to frown uncontrollably. At this moment, the Tao Sovereign's disciple, whose body had been smashed by Luo Fan, reassembled. In the blink of an eye, he reappeared among the Tao Sovereign's disciples and looked at Luo Fan from afar. Compared to the relaxed attitude of the other Tao Sovereign's disciples, his face was full of anger and displeasure. There was also a faint sense of disbelief that his ideas had been subverted. Fellow Taoist, the foundation of achieving the Tao is not something that you can keep. You'd better hand it over. A Tao Sovereign's disciple, who looked like an 11 or 12-year-old boy, said to Luo Fan in an old-fashioned manner. His words made the other Tao Sovereign's disciples smile and nod. It was as if what he said was the truth and could not be disobeyed. At this moment, there were more than 500 Tao Sovereign's disciples surrounding Luo Fan, and the number was still increasing. One by one, The Tao Sovereign's disciples gathered here from all directions and gradually arranged themselves in the surroundings. However, although they surrounded Luo Fan, not many of them looked at Luo Fan. On the contrary, they only glanced at him from the corner of their eyes. Most of their attention was focused on each other and the other Tao Sovereign's disciples. After standing still, they even began to greet and chat with each other. "It's really annoying." Luo Fan looked at them and sighed. His words made the Tao Sovereign's disciples look at him with strange eyes. That kind of look was like a diner suddenly being despised by the food he was about to eat. It was funny but also somewhat uncomfortable. "Are you not willing?" The 12 or 13-year-old Tao Sovereign's disciple frowned and said unhappily. "Don't be ungrateful. Treasures should be obtained by virtuous people. How can a rogue cultivator like you be qualified to obtain the Tao Foundation? If you don't hand it over, don't regret it when we take action." A female Tao Sovereign's disciple frowned and said. Her beautiful face was full of sincerity, and there was an inexplicable sense of mercy hidden in it. It seemed that she sincerely believed that what she said was the most beneficial choice for Luo Fan. In the end, the number of Tao Master's disciples stopped at about 630. In fact, there were still many Tao Sovereign's disciples paying attention to this place. Even at this time, Luo Fan could still feel the perception spreading from all directions. But obviously, so many Tao Sovereign's disciples were already too many in the eyes of the other Tao Sovereigns. If they joined in, it would only make the competition more fierce. Obviously, the chance of obtaining the Tao Foundation was not worth their participation. "Sure enough, your mentality is really incomprehensible." Luo Fan sighed and did not bother to listen to their arrogant ravings. Immediately, the divine ability of the immortal concept wrapped around his body, slowly spreading and growing. In the end, it turned into a huge human figure, gradually appearing. Not long after, it had turned into a shocking giant, standing around him with a powerful aura surrounding him. The surrounding void began to tremble under his aura, and the rules and laws were manifested bit by bit during this process. There seemed to be an incomparably huge network appearing in the surroundings. In the face of such a change, many of the Tao Sovereign's disciples showed a look of disbelief. It seemed that the rogue cultivator was actually going to attack them? How arrogant and crazy! Didn't he know how big the gap between the rogue cultivator and the Tao Sovereign's disciples was? Did he think that just because he had obtained a crude divine ability of concept, it was enough to fight against the real Tao Sovereign's disciples? However, those Tao Sovereign's disciples had never thought that the divine ability of Luo Fan in front of them was created by himself. They just thought that he had obtained this divine ability in some fortuitous encounter. It was not strange to obtain a divine ability in a fortuitous encounter. After all, each of the Tao Sovereign's disciples had a divine ability of concept, and some of them even had more than one divine ability. In this way, it was unknown how many billions of years had passed, and how many billions of Tao Sovereign's disciples had some divine abilities of concept that would eventually be obtained by other rogue cultivators. Under such circumstances, the crudeness of the divine ability of concept created by Luo Fan naturally meant that Luo Fan was not talented enough and did not have enough understanding. Even though he had obtained the divine ability of concept, he could not fully master it. In the end, he could only master this crude and semi-finished divine ability. With this understanding, it was easy to imagine what kind of speculation they had about Luo Fan's strength. It was natural for them to look down on him. It could even be said that if they could still look up to Luo Fan under such circumstances, they would have a problem instead. At this moment, a kind of anger of being humiliated emerged in the hearts of many of the Tao Sovereign's disciples. "It seems that we haven't fought for a long time, and the rogue cultivators have forgotten our strength," a Tao Sovereign's disciple said coldly at this time. The power in his body began to surge, and a powerful aura began to dissipate in all directions. Chapter 2101. Luo Fan didn't bother to pay attention to the Tao Master's disciples. At this moment, his heart skipped a beat. The divine power of the immortal concept that appeared on the surface of his body had already begun to take action. The divine power of the immortal concept raised its hand, and an immortal seal emerged. With this immortal seal, indescribable fluctuations emanated from his body and began to sweep out in all directions. He quickly took control of the rules and laws that appeared around him, took control of the surrounding spacetime, and even took control of the almost perfect world in the depths of spacetime. He scattered them, reconstructed them, and transformed them into all kinds of extremely subtle postures. He covered them with an indescribable light, a light that emitted an immortal aura. This change continued to spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of the Tao Master's disciples, and was about to completely swallow them. At this time, how could the Tao Master's disciples still be as carefree as before? Their expressions changed slightly. The power in their bodies surged, and a stream of divine power of the immortal concept was released from them. It evolved into various strange forms in the void, and blocked the power of the immortal concept. Crack, crack, crack. At this moment, an earth-shattering roar erupted from the point of contact between their divine sense and Luo Fan's divine sense of immortality. The terrifying shock wave directly scattered the surrounding spacetime, and even reconstructed the spacetime to produce various indescribable forms. It directly transformed into completely different spacetime and spread around the bodies of those Tao Masters, as if it was their own domain. Although the power of Luo Fan's divine power of the immortal concept was unparalleled, it was still a bit crude. The difference between dealing with one Tao Master's disciples and many Tao Master's disciples was not perfect. Therefore, at this time, the power of the immortal concept was enough to suppress the divine power of the Tao Master's disciples. But it couldn't suppress all their defenses at this time. However, the power was forcibly blocked not far from the disciples of the Tao Masters. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan clearly expected it. He did not stop at this time. His figure flashed and his surroundings trembled. The figure formed by the imperishable concept released a loud roar. Then, the fluctuations released from his body suddenly changed. In an instant, the world around the perception divine ability began to change from the original forceful impact to a silent state. It directly bypassed the bodies of the Tao Masters and converged behind them. In the end, it formed a huge world and directly enveloped the Tao Masters' disciples. Of course, the disciples of the Tao Masters still had their own defense, which still completely isolated their real bodies from the surrounding world constructed by Luo Fan. After all, they had not completely lost. However, even so, the changes in front of them had already left many Tao Masters' disciples dumbfounded. Their eyes were filled with indescribable anger. A Tao Master's disciple could not suppress the anger in his heart and roared at Luo Fan, "You actually want to catch all of us in one fell swoop." At this time, the power of the other Tao Master's disciples also began to surge, and the perception divine abilities that they had mastered began to endlessly surge out of their bodies. The path that these Tao Master's disciples walked was obviously the correct path that second senior brother had mentioned. In other words, after constantly comprehending and mastering the concepts, they would finally obtain a path that was most suitable for their worldview after countless years of accumulation. Compared to the Tao Master's disciples on the second level of the Tao Master's path, these Tao Master's disciples on the third level had mastered a lot more concept. Even the many concepts had already formed an indescribable combination, forming a variety of indescribable states. Some were like heaven and earth, some were like domains, and some were just purely space-time. These forms formed by different concepts were strong and weak. Some could have unimaginable defense, and some could have extraordinary attack power. But obviously, every concept could correspond to a corresponding perception divine ability. If different concepts were used to construct different divine abilities, the power and direction of power would also be different. Regarding all of these, Luo Fan had only vaguely comprehended them before. But at this moment, when he enveloped the many Tao Master's disciples in the world constructed by his indestructible world, he finally experienced the various comprehensions that he originally had. He saw circles of images constantly appearing on the bodies of the Tao Master's disciples. The world constructed by the indestructible concept divine ability suffered an indescribable impact at this moment. At every moment, the indestructible concept divine ability itself was withstanding that indescribable impact. It constantly distorted and trembled, and the many powers that had fused with the indestructible concept divine ability were constantly collapsing. If it wasn't for Luo Fan constantly making up for it and changing the way these powers were constructed through various circumstances, the indestructible concept divine ability would have been shattered in the first instant. However, although this process was arduous, it was also a great opportunity for him. This was because he could feel the flaws and omissions of his indestructible concept divine ability in this conflict. Every adjustment was to push the indestructible concept divine ability to a more perfect level. It wasn't hard to imagine that if he could survive this battle, his concept of indestructibility would have a drastic improvement. At this moment, Luo Fan was extremely glad that he had cultivated on the second level of the Tao Master's path. If he hadn't cultivated on the second level of the Tao Master's path, his indestructible concept divine ability wouldn't have reached its current level. If he couldn't reach this level, he would be in danger even if he had to fight against any of the Tao Master's disciples, let alone directly sealing them with a slight thought. The indestructible concept divine ability moved slightly, and the world constructed by the indestructible concept divine ability began to gradually change shape. A pitch-black void replaced the space that originally seemed rather normal, and it continued to spread out. In the blink of an eye, this area had already turned into a vast starry sky. In this starry sky, the number of stars was extremely sparse. Roughly speaking, there were only about 600 of them. That's right, these stars were none other than the aggregation of the various concepts or the manifestation of the concept divine ability constructed by the Tao Master's disciples. In such a pitch-black void, they were extremely dazzling and difficult for anyone to ignore. Just as the spacetime changed, the binding force of the spacetime on the Tao Master's disciples began to increase. It was as though there was an indescribable power that was constantly being added to their defenses, constantly pressuring them, making it hard for them to break free. At the beginning, the Tao Master's disciples only felt anger from being offended. But as time passed, as the binding force grew stronger and stronger, it became harder and harder for them to struggle. In their anger, there was an inexplicable panic. Could it be that this person really has the strength to threaten us? This thought began to unknowingly appear in the hearts of the Tao Master's disciples. Although they quickly extinguished this thought, believing that it was impossible for such a situation to occur. But after all, this thought had already appeared. No matter how thoroughly they extinguished it, it was impossible to completely eliminate it. It could be imagined that this thought would inevitably appear more and more frequently as time passed. In the end, it would truly affect their response and affect their mentality. With this change, the means of the Tao Master's disciples became more and more violent. When they struggled, the fluctuations produced became even more terrifying. Just as the Tao Master's disciples were constantly struggling, an indescribable fluctuation appeared out of nowhere and directly enveloped the spacetime within an unknown radius of tens of thousands of miles. Then, a sense of transcendence naturally emerged in the hearts of the Tao Master's disciples and Luo Fan. Someone is ascending? At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly, and he already understood what was going on. This situation was clearly that a cultivator had triggered the rules of the Tao Master's path and wanted to ascend to a higher level of the Tao Master's path. With a slight sense, he had already found the source of this change. It was none other than the reincarnation of the Tao Master who first met Luo Fan. At this moment, the reincarnation of the Tao Master was only left with less than a third of his body. His head and most of his chest were suspended in the starry sky constructed by Luo Fan's immortal concept divine sense. The aura around his body was wild, and an inexplicable fluctuation penetrated the barrier of space-time and connected with a certain magnificent existence above the void. The fluctuation of transcendence began to sweep the surrounding space-time, and then continued to gather towards where he was. As the fluctuation gathered, the reincarnation of the Tao Master was gradually replenished. After that, it began to gradually turn into nothingness, as though it was gradually breaking free from all restraints and stepping into a brand new, higher place. At this moment, there was fear, lingering fear, and also relief on his face. The way they looked at their surroundings was like that of a child looking at a place filled with monsters. That kind of wariness and fear was simply about to materialize. The reincarnation of the Tao Master had never mastered the divine sense. For him, the attack released by Luo Fan's immortal concept divine sense was a completely irresistible attack. Under such an attack, he had no ability to resist at all. Half of his body had already been minced. This mincing had even penetrated deep into the conceptual level, causing the concept of existence of half of his body to almost dissipate. If he hadn't reacted quickly and triggered the ascension rules of the Tao Master's path, which he could have triggered long ago, so that he was protected by the Tao Master's path, he wouldn't have been completely minced and all traces of his existence completely erased. Under such an encounter, how could he not be afraid of his surroundings? How could he not be filled with vigilance? Have a safe journey. I won't see you off, Luo Fan said indifferently. His words directly entered the reincarnation of the Tao Master's ears, causing his body to tremble again. There was a kind of panic on his face, but he urged his power even more intensely. He wanted the Tao Master's path's rules to quickly lead him to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Unfortunately, the Tao Master's path's rules were obviously not something he could influence. No matter how he urged, the ascension speed of the Tao Master's path's rules was still not much different from before. It was still unhurriedly taking him up, and the speed at which his figure dissipated was not different from before. In the end, it took him dozens of breaths of time to completely disappear. He had truly left the third level of the Tao Master's path and stepped into the fourth level. With this change, the fluctuation of transcendent aura that had emerged out of thin air completely disappeared, and the area returned to its original extremely tense state. After all, he's not that stupid after all. At this time, the reincarnation of the Tao Master's master murmured with some mixed feelings. Although he was very unhappy with the reincarnation of the Tao Master's mistake and even had the idea of punishing him, he was still his disciple after all. But in the end, he was still his disciple. Watching him die before his eyes made him feel a little uncomfortable. Now that the reincarnation of the Tao Master had found a way to save himself, he naturally could not be happy. Although that choice would affect his cultivation, the ascension of the reincarnation of the Tao Master's path was like an interlude. It attracted a lot of attention at that time, but after that, it no longer affected anything. The disciples of the Tao Masters who should struggle and fight back still fought back, and Luo Fan who should restrict and shackle them still did so. Luo Fan originally had the thought of teaching these Tao sovereigns a lesson. However, after he sensed that he could restrain them and use their divine abilities to help him cultivate the divine ability of the immortal concept, his thought had completely disappeared. At this time, he had already wholeheartedly wanted to learn more about the construction of divine senses from the disciples of the Tao Master, so that his divine sense of immortality idea could become more and more perfect. In this way, when he could easily escape, he did not choose to escape. Instead, he quietly floated in the starry sky constructed by the divine sense of immortality idea, constantly adjusting the internal power structure of the divine sense of immortality idea and constantly integrating the mysteries of the Tao Master's divine sense of immortality idea into it. In this way, time passed minute by minute and second by second. Unknowingly, several years had passed. During these years, the disciples of the Tao Masters were completely imprisoned in this starry sky. Each of their divine sense of immortality idea was pushed to the limit, trying their best to break out of this starry sky. In the beginning, they still wanted to let Luo Fan know how noble and powerful the disciples of the Tao Masters were. However, as time passed, as the power of the divine sense of immortality idea became stronger and stronger, but the changes in the environment became smaller and smaller, this idea gradually disappeared. Now, the disciples of the Tao Master's divine sense of immortality idea had already become escaping, far away from this rogue cultivator, and returning to their own territory to cultivate in peace. The reason for this was very simple. Through this feedback, they had already confirmed that even if they were unwilling to admit it, they could not compare to that rogue cultivator. As for the so-called Tao Foundation, at this time, none of them dared to have any thoughts about it. It was very normal for an existence that was stronger than them to possess the Tao Foundation. Unfortunately, although their thoughts had changed, they were no longer in control of the situation. Now, it was Luo Fan who was in control of the situation. As long as Luo Fan refused to let them go, they could not leave. This situation was a completely strange humiliation for the disciples of the Tao Masters, so they did not know how to react. They could only passively resist the shackles of the starry sky and resist the oppression of them according to Luo Fan's will. Enough! At this time, an inexplicable voice came into Luo Fan's ears. This voice did not come from the disciples of the Tao Masters who were restrained by him, but from outside the starry sky constructed by the divine sense of immortality, from the third level of the Tao Master's path. At first, the voice sounded quite peaceful, but if one listened carefully, they would find that there was an unshakable majesty in the depths of the voice. It seemed to be saying, "I can be peaceful, but you can't really treat me as peaceful. Is that enough?" Luo Fan asked with a dull look. He naturally knew that he could not really confine the disciples of the Tao Masters here. After all, this area was the third level of the Tao Master's path controlled by the disciples of the Tao Master. Here, in addition to the disciples of the Tao Masters who were imprisoned by him, there were tens of thousands of times more disciples of the Tao Masters. Among so many disciples of the Tao Masters, how could there be no one who was familiar with the imprisoned disciples? Since there were familiar people, it was natural for them to intervene at some point and stop him from continuing to imprison the disciples of the Tao Masters. Chapter 2102. As he spoke, a ray of light fell from the sky and violently tore apart the starry sky that Luo Fan had constructed with the help of the immortal concept divine sense. In an instant, it swept towards the hundreds of disciples of the Tao Masters and carried them out of the starry sky. It was difficult to describe what kind of light it was. It seemed to be all-encompassing and extremely pure. From the light, Luo Fan could sense a unique aura that belonged to the divine sense of concept. Through comparison, he even sensed that the core of the divine sense of concept was an idea that he was very familiar with. It was an assimilation idea. Moreover, although the strength of the idea itself was far inferior to his immortal concept, it was several times stronger than the basic idea of the divine sense of concept built by the other disciples of the Tao Masters. In addition, the structure of the divine sense of concept itself was extremely exquisite, far surpassing the divine sense of concept of Tao Masters. The power of the combination of the two was beyond imagination. This led to the current situation. The divine sense of concept had brazenly penetrated the starry sky constructed by his immortal concept divine sense and reached the place where the disciples of the Tao Masters were. Could it be that fellow Taoist thinks that you can save them like this? Luo Fan said lightly. As he said this, his heart stirred slightly. The divine sense of immortal concept moved slightly and a handprint was formed. Under this handprint, the entire boundless void began to change rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had turned from the void into a continent. It was also incomparably vast, but the restrictive power was more than 10,000 times stronger than before. If the cultivators who had entered the eternal world built by the second layer of Luo Fan's Tao Master Path saw this continent, they would find it so familiar, so similar to a certain world in the eternal world. At this moment, an indescribable idea was born out of thin air and directly entangled the divine sense of concept that came from the outside and wrapped around the disciples of the Tao Masters. Sizzle, sizzle, sizzle. At this moment, the divine sense of perception began to become chaotic, and the endless power contained in it began to dissipate. Wisps of power were constantly consumed, and the process of the escape with the many Tao Masters' disciples was also stopped in an instant. A surprised voice came from the void. Then, a figure appeared out of nowhere and floated above the area covered by the power of Luo Fan's imperishable concept. He looked down at the area, and the light in his eyes pierced through all obstacles, directly seeing the continent inside the divine ability. To be able to derive other powers, what a strange method! The figure mumbled as he watched. At this moment, he clearly felt that his god art had been impacted by a power that was completely different from the power he had sensed before. Although this power had not truly been constructed into a concept god art, its power itself was much weaker than the god art that the opponent had originally cast. However, because the emergence of this power was not within his control, his god art did not respond to it. Therefore, at this time, this relatively weak power burst out with an unimaginable effect. It directly stopped his god art, causing his god art to be stuck there, unable to achieve his goal. However, power was power. If he was not prepared for it, he might be delayed, but as long as he had enough power, he could eventually regroup and directly overcome all difficulties to achieve his goal. Just as this figure was about to make a move, an indescribable suction force acted on his perception god art. It was even transmitted to his body through the perception god art, wanting to pull him into the opponent's god art below. In the face of this change, the figure frowned. "Fellow Taoist, do you also want to deal with me?" This figure was a young man with red lips, white teeth, fair skin, and an inexplicably handsome face. At this moment, there was a trace of anger in the young man's eyes, as if he had been greatly offended. He was also a Tao Master's disciple, and even a Tao Master's disciple whose status and strength were much stronger than the hundreds of Tao Master's disciples before. Even if he appeared to be humble, the arrogance in his heart would not be any less than that of those Tao Master's disciples. Previously, he could apologize for the behavior of the other Tao Master's disciples, but it did not mean that he could ignore the other cultivators' contempt towards him. At this moment, when he felt that Luo Fan's almost disdainful attitude towards him, the anger in his heart finally exploded. At this moment, he sneered and raised his hand to point downwards. In an instant, another concept god art rushed out of his hand and turned into a large world in the void, crushing straight down towards the land below. The core of the concept god art he released later was none other than the concept of land. This concept of earth was incomparably heavy, and after it was turned into a concept divine ability, that heavy characteristic was strengthened to an unimaginable degree. Just its appearance was enough to cause the surrounding space to tremble, and the laws in the surroundings to tremble and appear constantly. Under such a god art crushing down, even Luo Fan's immortal concept god art felt an indescribable pressure at this moment. The body of the immortal concept god art began to tremble slightly. At this moment, there was only an inexplicable expression on Luo Fan's face. It seemed to be a little happy and even a little expectant, but there was no panic or fear. It was as if the land crushing down from above was not an attack at all, but a direct gift of comprehension. Rumble, 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 the two finally came into contact, and at this moment, the powerful impact began to sweep in all directions from the point of contact between the two. No one knew how many almost perfect worlds were completely crushed at this moment. If the terrible destructive power had been in other spacetime, perhaps even the big world would have been reconstructed under this impact. The world constructed by Luo Fan's immortal concept God art completely collapsed at the first moment. At the same time, the binding power of the ray of light on the disciples of the Tao Masters and the disciples of the Tao Masters behind them completely disappeared. An inexplicable sense of relief emerged in the hearts of the disciples of the Tao Masters. At this moment, the disciples of the Tao Masters were filled with a kind of joy, and also, anger. The joy, of course, was because they were no longer shackled and imprisoned. The anger, on the other hand, was because they recalled their experience in the past few years, and recalled that as the disciples of the high and mighty Tao Masters, they were actually treated like this by a rogue cultivator. This was simply a humiliation to them. Rays of light broke through the shackles, withstood the shock wave, and shot up into the sky, quickly escaping from the range of the impact. At this time, there was not much pity on Luo Fan's face. On the contrary, there was a trace of joy on his face. So, the divine sense can be constructed in this way. He murmured. As he murmured, the layer of immortal concept God art covering the surface of his body began to wriggle slightly, and its structure became more and more exquisite, detailed, and complex in the process. Under this construction, the power of the immortal concept God art itself seemed to begin to climb to an unimaginable height. In just a few short moments, it had already increased by many times. Good talent. At this time, the disciple of the Tao Master who appeared later could not help but exclaim. However, even if you have good talent, it is not the capital for you to be arrogant. The gap between cultivators is not something that can be bridged by talent alone, the Tao Lord's disciple said in an indifferent tone. As he spoke, he casually waved his hand. Endless light began to gather in the void, turning into a huge palm that pressed down on Luo Fan. At this moment, the immortal concept God art covering the surface of Luo Fan's body suddenly raised its head, and the corner of its mouth curled into a sneer. Then, it suddenly raised its hand and pointed at the palm. The shattered world instantly began to condense and reconstruct itself, directly wrapping the huge palm within it. As it wrapped itself around the palm, the connection between the palm and the Tao Master's disciple rapidly weakened, causing the Tao Master's disciple's control over the palm to be delayed for a moment. But that moment was enough to turn the entire situation upside down. Under the effect of the world, all the power in the palm was instantly split apart, turning into countless rays of light that streaked across the sky like meteors. They charged towards the ground and smashed into the ground with loud rumbling sounds, causing a huge amount of dust to rise. The light was originally condensed from extremely pure power, but after this change, it had completely changed form. It directly turned into all things in the world, like mountains, rivers, seas, deserts, buildings, and plants. They covered the area where the palm smashed down, changing the originally extremely lonely world. These powers were still the power of the Tao Master's disciple, and the deep connection between them still existed. However, it was obvious that such a change in form had already made it difficult for the Tao Master's disciples to control these powers. It was indeed possible for him to control these powers again, but he needed to experience these powers again and find the corresponding method. Obviously, how could Luo Fan give him such a chance at this time? At this moment, his next plan had already begun. At this moment, the world began to expand, and in the blink of an eye, it had already swallowed the many disciples of the Tao Master above, as well as the Tao Master's disciple that appeared later. This is indestructible? At this moment, the Tao Master's disciple finally reacted, and his face was filled with shock. It was only then that he realized that the core concept of the divine ability that Luo Fan had displayed was the indestructible concept, and nothing else. The indestructible concept was very different from other concepts. This was because the indestructible concept was the fundamental characteristic of a true saint. In other words, it was also what many cultivators who pursued to become a true saint cared about the most. Such an indestructible concept naturally had all kinds of indescribable characteristics, and the difficulty of cultivating it had reached an unimaginable height. Normally, a cultivator would only condense an indestructible concept at the last stage of their cultivation when they were about to break through to the true divine realm. However, no one had ever tried to condense this concept before that. Moreover, even if there was someone who didn't walk the path of an ordinary person, it would still be extremely difficult to condense it. Of course, the power of the indestructible concept corresponded to this difficulty. Not to mention anything else, the indestructible concept itself was dozens or even hundreds of times more powerful than ordinary concepts at the same level. On top of that, it possessed an indestructible characteristic that allowed it to recover and reform at any time. Even if it was destroyed, it wouldn't suffer any damage. It was even more difficult to deal with than a normal 1,000 concept. It was precisely because of this indestructible concept that he could not believe that there was a cultivator who dared to condense such an indestructible concept at this stage. Just now, when he sensed that Luo Fan's divine sense of concept had the performance of the indestructible concept, he just felt that it was similar to the indestructible concept. He did not really feel that it was the real indestructible concept, until now, when his divine sense of concept really came into contact with the deep changes of Luo Fan's divine sense of concept. He really confirmed that this concept was actually the indestructible concept. He was a disciple of a Tao master, so he had a wide range of knowledge. At this moment, countless thoughts kept emerging in his mind, and all kinds of conclusions were made and constantly rejected. Finally, an idea occupied the main body of his mind, and a look of shock and pity appeared on his face. "You actually go against the flow. It's a pity that you have such a talent." These words came out of his mouth at this moment, and directly caused a variety of inexplicable expressions to appear on the faces of many disciples of Tao masters. Compared with the neutral expression on the face of this disciple of a Tao master who had seen through the concept condensed by Luo Fan, the expressions of other disciples of Tao masters all had a flavor of gloating on their faces. He actually went against the flow of tribulations. It seems that there is no possibility for him to achieve the Tao. Even if he has the foundation to achieve the Tao, it will only be a waste. At this time, a disciple of a Tao master looked a little happy at this time, and said with some relief. Luo Fan did not care about their various expressions. At this time, the world constructed by the divine sense of indestructible concept had already enveloped many disciples of Tao masters. It was not until they were completely enveloped by the world that those disciples of Tao masters suddenly came to their senses, and all of their expressions became unsightly. Luo Fan's behavior was really too incomprehensible. When a normal person heard the discussion about the key to his cultivation, he would not completely ignore it no matter what. How could he continue to attack his opponent as if he had not heard it? "The path that I'm taking may be against the flow of time in your eyes, but in my opinion, isn't your path also against the flow of time?" Luo Fan said indifferently. As he spoke, the power of the divine sense of indestructible concept began to crush towards the disciples of Tao masters. At this moment, no matter how many words the disciples of Tao masters wanted to say, they could only use their divine abilities to resist the attacks. At this moment, different colors of light began to appear on their bodies, turning into circles of defense that enveloped them, forming independent domains that intercepted the power of the divine sense of indestructible concept and protected their own safety. "Fellow Taoist, don't you know who I am?" The disciple of Tao Master who came later spoke at this moment. He was much stronger than the other disciples of Tao Masters, but at this moment, he seemed to be much more relaxed than the other disciples. With just a casual movement, he had already defended against the power of the divine sense of indestructible concept that erupted from Luo Fan's divine sense of indestructible concept. Faintly, he was trying to communicate with the power of his divine sense of indestructible concept that had rushed into this part of the world, causing the power to constantly tremble and begin to return to its original state. However, it was suppressed by Luo Fan's divine sense of indestructible concept. What does it have to do with me, who you are, fellow Taoist? Luo Fan said. This made the disciple of Tao Master speechless. Seriously speaking, what Luo Fan said was not wrong. He did not want anything from him, so what did it have to do with whether he knew him or not? This is the third senior brother. You, a rogue cultivator, have such a great opportunity to step into this area, but you don't know how to be cautious. Now you actually dare to provoke the third senior brother. You really have a death wish. At this moment, a disciple of Tao Master shouted angrily. The third senior brother? Your strength is not like the third senior brothers. Luo Fan ignored the disciple of Tao Master who shouted angrily. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the so-called third senior brother with an inquiring look on his face. The third senior brother was naturally not the third disciple of an expert, but the disciple of the most powerful Tao Master in the entire third level of the Tao Master's path. He was also the disciple of the Tao Master who was respected as the leader of many disciples of Tao Masters. In the second level of the Tao Master's path, such a disciple of Tao Master was called the second senior brother. In the fourth level, this title would become the fourth senior brother, and in the third level, of course, he would be called the third senior brother. It seems that fellow Taoist should have seen the second senior brother. At this moment, the third senior brother showed a look of understanding on his face and said so. Of course I have seen it. Isn't that how you disciples of Tao Masters are? If anything unexpected happens, you will directly flip the table. Luo Fan looked at the third senior brother, his expression unchanged, and said so. Chapter 2103. You must be joking. I am indeed the third senior brother. It's just that this is just a projection of my avatar. The strength I can display doesn't match my identity, the third senior brother said with a smile. A projection of an avatar? It seems that your location is too far away from here. Luo Fan listened and instantly came to a realization. He understood something. For existences at their level, as long as they could sense an area, they would be able to arrive at an extremely fast speed. He had already imprisoned the disciples of the Tao Masters here for several years. If the third senior brother had sensed the changes here, then no matter where he was, he would definitely rush over after such a long period of time. However, the third senior brother did not come here personally. Instead, he came here through the projection of an avatar and rushed over to help the disciples of the Tao Masters. There was only one possibility. He was not in this area, but was extremely far away from here. It was a distance that could only be calculated by adding countless large worlds together. That was the only reason why he needed to use the projection of an avatar to rush over. It's true. The third level is too vast. Even I can't cover the entire third level with my power. Now I can only use the projection of an avatar to fight with you. The third senior brother sighed. If that's the case, then please help me with my cultivation. Luo Fan said with a smile after listening to Suemo. As he spoke, the divine ability of the immortal concept shook, and an even stronger power erupted from it. The whole world began to undergo various indescribable changes. Waves of indescribable power began to madly surge towards the disciples of the Tao Masters, including the projection of the third senior brother's doppelganger. The third senior brother was stunned in the face of such a change. He did not expect that the third senior brother would still dare to attack after he had made it clear. Doesn't he know that the third senior brother is able to fight with the third senior brother even though I'm only a projection of an avatar? If the third senior brother's real body arrives, he will definitely be able to destroy the third senior brother. As his thoughts spun, he suddenly realized the mistake he had made. This was the Tao Master path. In this place, the law of ascension was dominant, and the lone cultivator before him had clearly reached the realm where he could ascend. In this way, as long as he wanted to, he could activate the soaring body rule at any time, and under the protection of the soaring rule, he could directly ascend to the fourth level of the road to Tao Master. At that time, no matter how strong he was, how could he hurt him? With such a backup plan, he naturally didn't need to care about how strong he was. He only needed to wholeheartedly do what he wanted. After understanding this, his expression turned ugly, and there was faint regret in his heart. He regretted his carelessness earlier, regretted that it was only a projection of his avatar, and he thought that the other party would submit once they knew his strength, so he didn't care about the other party's methods. If he had thought of this earlier, he might still have been at a disadvantage in the battle, or perhaps he would still have allowed Luo Fan to achieve his goal, but he wouldn't have been sealed in the power of the divine ability so easily. This is going to be troublesome. He frowned as he thought of this, but he didn't stop his movements. Streams of divine sense surged out under his control, intertwining with the powerful power produced by the divine sense of indestructible divine sense. All kinds of indescribable reactions occurred, stimulating all kinds of unimaginable power and producing many strange effects. The disciples of the Tao Masters were originally waiting for the third senior brother to show off his power and subdue the lone cultivator, but they didn't expect that even the third senior brother would fall into the same fate as them. For a moment their expressions turned ugly. "How dare you? Don't you want to live any more?" A disciple of the Tao Masters shouted at Luo Fan. The disciples of the Tao Masters naturally didn't dare to shout at the third senior brother. Due to the anger and displeasure in their hearts, the target of their shout was, of course, Luo Fan. In the face of such a shout, Luo Fan's expression was quite calm. He didn't take their shout to heart at all. He was still wholeheartedly controlling the divine ability of immortality to fight against the other's divine ability of immortality. He constantly comprehended his own shortcomings and constantly made up for his divine ability of immortality, allowing his divine ability of immortality to grow bit by bit in the process. The roars of the disciples of the Tao Masters only lasted for a few days before they stopped. This was because, in the past few days, they had already confirmed that the mentality of the lone cultivator in front of them was beyond their imagination. No matter how harsh their words were, even if they threatened and tempted him, the other party's mentality didn't change at all. If they continued to speak, it would just be a waste of their saliva. Under such circumstances, they had no choice but to exert even more powerful means. How could they not know that their actions were completely in line with the other party's intentions? The other party wanted to use their divine ability to refine his own divine ability. However, so what if they knew? Couldn't they resist? They couldn't let the other party seize the opportunity to defeat them just because they stopped, right? Fortunately, the disciples here were all disciples of the Tao Masters. They were the disciples of the Tao Masters whose obsession with cultivation was so strong that it was difficult to get rid of it. If it weren't for their obsession, they might not have been able to hold on in such a sullen state. They might have directly activated the Ascension Rule and directly left the third level of the Tao Master's path for the fourth level. As such changes occurred, time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had passed. Over the past 10,000 years, the disciples of the Tao Masters had been suffering in hell. They had endured unbearable pain at every moment. Among them, more than half of the disciples of the Tao Masters were seriously injured because they couldn't keep up with Luo Fan's attack. They had to rely on the help of the other disciples to resist the attacks and avoid the ultimate outcome of the Ascension Rule. As a result, The disciples of the Tao Masters had unknowingly divided into several camps and grouped together to resist the power of Luo Fan's divine ability of the immortal concept. From the changes of the disciples of the Tao Masters, it could be seen how much progress Luo Fan had made in the past 10,000 years. At this moment, the power of the divine ability of the immortal concept had increased by nearly 10 times compared to before. On the other hand, the structure of the indestructible concept God Art itself was more than 100 times more exquisite than before. The entire indestructible concept God Art could no longer be described as crude. Instead, it could only be described as exquisite and profound. At this moment, the divine ability of the immortal concept floating on the surface of his body was like a living thing. It actively began to change its posture and its movements according to the various resistance it encountered. The entire world that was constructed by it had completely changed. It was no longer like the original scene of a continent. Instead, it had turned into separate continents, each of which had a disciple of the Tao Master sealed in it. What existed between the continents was not an ocean, but streams of light that contained infinite destructive power. Even the disciples of the Tao Master dared not approach the streams of light. Compared to the divine ability of the immortal concept itself becoming more and more active, as if it had turned into a real cultivator, Luo Fan himself had fallen into a kind of silence. At this moment, he quietly floated inside the divine ability of the immortal concept, sitting cross-legged. There was no sound or movement from his body. It looked like a corpse, a statue, not like a living creature at all. In fact, from more than 3,000 years ago until now, he had been in this inexplicable state. It could be said that from that time on, it was no longer him who controlled the divine ability of the immortal concept to attack and oppress the disciples of the Tao Masters, but the divine ability of the immortal concept itself. Of course, this change did not have a big impact on the disciples of the Tao Masters, because whether it was the divine ability of the immortal concept itself that changed the attack, or the attack under the control of Luo Fan, they only had one way to deal with it, and that was to hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Even if they had to urge their own vitality, they had to hold on. The reason why Luo Fan fell into this state was quite simple. He had an epiphany that he hadn't expected at all. The divine ability of the immortal concept was the sublimation and application of the power of the immortal concept. In this sublimation and application, all the principles and mysteries behind the immortal concept were interpreted in an extreme direction. For a cultivator who was just learning the divine ability, this process of interpretation could only be regarded as a step-by-step process. They could only continue to sublimate their ability to use the concept. However, for Luo Fan, who was currently creating, modifying, and perfecting this divine ability, this kind of explanation was actually another way to comprehend the concept of indestructibility from another angle. In this way, when he perfected the divine ability of the immortal concept to a certain extent, it would naturally give him a new understanding of the immortal concept. And because of his own cultivation method, this new understanding would naturally spread to his entire worldview of the immortal concept. Then, he would have a further understanding of everything about the worldview of the immortal concept. The worldview of the immortal concept was the foundation of Luo Fan's cultivation, and it was the most important thing that he relied on to become a true divine. Any understanding in this aspect was enough to change his cultivation realm, and it was enough to trigger an all-round change in him, and at this time, he was immersed in this all-round change. It was as if endless inspiration was suddenly born from the depths of his heart, and countless principles about the worldview of the immortal concept kept emerging from the bottom of his heart at this time. These principles weren't limited to the immortal concept, but almost every concept in his worldview of the immortal concept. It was as if he had instantly opened a door to the worldview of the immortal concept, and suddenly endless worldview of the immortal concept surged out from that door and directly integrated into his heart. In a trance, his worldview of the immortal concept began to undergo some subtle changes. His control over the worldview of the immortal concept seemed to have become much deeper. In fact, there were even many omissions that he couldn't detect without deep control that began to emerge at this time and gradually appeared in his heart, making him feel that his worldview of the immortal concept was involuntarily being perfected. It was like watching from the side, and doing it himself would have a completely different feeling. In the past, he could also control the worldview of the immortal concept. However, that kind of control wasn't deep enough. Compared to now, it was like watching from the side. Under such circumstances, compared to now, the omissions that he could discover in the past would naturally be much fewer. At a certain moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled, and he suddenly felt an indescribable pressure descend on his heart. The fifth great tribulation is finally clear. This thought instantly emerged in his heart. That inexplicable pressure came from the state of chaos, from his fifth great tribulation. In the past, he could only clearly sense the existence of the fifth great tribulation. But now, in the process of his cultivation realm growing unknowingly, he finally sensed the time of the fifth great tribulation, between 300 billion years and 3 trillion years. This was the time that he sensed that the fifth great tribulation was about to descend. This period of time was extremely long, close to 3 trillion years, and it could be said to be an extremely inaccurate time. However, after all, he had already sensed the time. Compared to the original time when he could only clearly sense the existence of the immortal concept but couldn't know the specific time, this degree of improvement could already be regarded as extremely great. At this time, Luo Fan came back to his senses and looked up. At this moment, the immortal concept divine sense had completely suppressed the many Tao masters, so that they had almost completely merged into a whole, and could barely resist the immortal concept divine sense divine sense divine sense. From the perspective of heaven and earth, at this time, the many continents had been connected together through various mysterious methods. The power between them communicated with each other, and the divine sense complemented each other, but vaguely constructed a mysterious formation. As the power flowed, it produced a power that was far beyond the superposition of each power, and resisted all kinds of mysterious and wonderful attacks from the sky. His vision penetrated all obstacles, and he directly saw the third senior brother. At this moment, the third senior brother's expression had also become rather ugly. Although there was no fierceness flickering in his eyes, there was an indescribable annoyance in the depths of his eyes. As a doppelganger projection of the third senior brother, his own strength was indeed insufficient. But after all, his realm was still there, and the effect of his divine ability was incomparable to that of other disciples of Tao masters. Therefore, at this time, when the power of the many Tao masters gathered together, he naturally became the leader and controlled the entire power combination. Fellow cultivator has woken up? At this moment, the third senior brother seemed to have sensed Luo Fan's gaze and suddenly spoke. Hearing this, the expressions of the other Tao masters changed slightly. At this time, the power of the divine sense of immortality was slightly restrained and did not disappear immediately. However, the pressure on the disciples of the Tao masters had been maintained at a stable level, which allowed them to slow down, but not give them a chance to turn the situation around. "I didn't expect you to know that I wasn't in control just now," Luo Fan said calmly. His voice directly entered the third senior brother's ears. The third senior brother smiled faintly and said, "Of course I know. Those attacks just now did not contain the characteristics of your will. If I can't sense this, I wouldn't dare to call myself the third senior brother." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled slightly and said, "I see. It seems that there is still room for improvement. Since you have woken up now, your cultivation should have come to an end, right?" The third senior brother asked calmly. "It has indeed come to an end. I can actually let you go at this time," Luo Fan said. "And then? Since we can let you go, what's your choice?" The third senior brother frowned and asked, I really wanted to let you guys go, but you guys aren't willing to let me go. Luo Fan sighed and said regretfully. The third senior brother frowned. Obviously, he did not understand what Luo Fan meant. However, he was the third senior brother after all. Here, he was just a doppelganger projection. Soon, he understood what was going on with various means. However, at this moment, outside this area, there were already tens of thousands of Tao Masters who had set up a huge formation around this area, firmly encircling this area. This array formation had yet to be activated and was still in a hidden state. If one were to look at it from an ordinary point of view, it would be impossible to see its existence. However, from the perspective of the perception divine ability, it could clearly sense that there was a barrier between this area and the outside world within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles. This barrier had not yet been fully formed, so it could only be sensed slightly. However, with its knowledge, it was quite clear that once the formation was activated, the barrier would instantly turn into a natural moat, directly separating this area from the outside world, turning the two into relatively independent existences. This area is going to be separated into the area where the individual cultivator is. At this moment, a look of extreme shock appeared on his face. Who made such a decision? Who dares to make such a decision? At this time, this was the only thought that appeared in his mind. Chapter 2104. Who the hell is it? The third senior brother's face darkened and his heart was filled with disbelief. Please search for new updates. Although his position as the third senior brother did not give him the absolute power to control the entire third level of the Tao Master's path, it was still an identity that had considerable control over the entire world. Such an identity was obviously recognized by all the Tao Master's disciples. Normally, as long as he did not approve it, he would not be allowed to gather more than a certain number of the Tao Master's disciples to do something, let alone deal with him. But now, here, when he was still fighting with others, there were so many Tao Master's disciples gathered together and set up such a formation to separate the Tao Master's path. They even wanted to exile him. Is it the real body? This was the first thought that came to his mind. He was here as a doppelganger projection, so everything here would be perceived by the real body. However, the real body could control what he knew and felt. If the real body wanted to be perceived by him, he could naturally perceive it. But if the real body did not want to be perceived by him, he naturally could not perceive it. To be able to mobilize so many disciples of the Tao Master, and to be exiled along with him, the most likely and reasonable person was obviously his real body. However, this obviously raised another question. That was, why did his real body do this? It was normal to exile them. After all, an individual cultivator who subverted their views was here and posed a threat to the absolute ruling position of the Tao Master's disciples. It seemed reasonable to exile him. What he could not figure out was why the real body would hide it from him. Although the doppelganger projection and the real body were separated, the two were fundamentally the same person. The real body hid the doppelganger and exiled it. Wasn't this equivalent to betraying himself? Ordinary people would not do such a thing, let alone the disciples of the Tao Master who had reached the third level of the Tao Master's path. All kinds of inexplicable thoughts emerged in the third senior brother's mind. In the blink of an eye, he had completely rejected the possibility that the real body was behind all this. He was also the third senior brother. His thoughts and all his ideas were the same as the real body. Under such circumstances, he could naturally deduce the thinking of the main body and understand what the main body would do in response to any situation. In his mind, it was impossible for his real body to make such a choice under any possible circumstances. It was impossible for him, together with the other Tao Masters, to exile him while hiding the doppelganger projection. Since it's not the original body, then who is it? This was the question that had appeared in his mind since the beginning. In that instant, his expression became extremely ugly, and he tried his best to communicate with his main body. However, this communication was like a clay ox entering the sea. There was no response at all. He didn't know if the original body had cut off the connection with him, or if the connection between him and the original body had been cut off by the person behind the scenes. Looks like you guys aren't the ones sacrificing yourselves. At this moment, Luo Fan realized what was going on and couldn't help but laugh. Hearing this, the expressions of the Tao Master's disciples changed slightly. At this time, except for the third senior brother, the other disciples of the Tao Masters began to feel that something was wrong and began to explore the surroundings, looking for abnormalities. After all, they were all disciples of the Tao Masters, and their knowledge and ability were not comparable to that of ordinary cultivators. Although the formation was obscure, it was impossible for it to escape their senses. Soon, the disciples of the Tao Masters found out what was going on one after another. For a moment, their expressions became extremely ugly. Third senior brother? Why did you exile us? A Tao Master's disciple directly shouted at the third senior brother. Looking at his aggrieved and angry appearance, if the third senior brother didn't give him an explanation, he was afraid that he would directly fall out with him. The other Tao Master's disciples also showed a kind of anger on their faces, and their eyes contained strong doubts and vigilance. Anyone who was sacrificed would have a similar mentality of suspicion. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan slightly relaxed the pressure on the Tao Master's disciples. Of course, it was only a slight relaxation, but it did not completely stop the pressure. It was not only because he still had doubts about them, but also because even if they were also victims, it was not the time to completely stop the battle. After all, the Tao Master's disciples outside had already completely set up the exile formation. Although it was not completely activated to completely separate this area, it was only because they were waiting for an opportunity. If they suddenly stopped fighting at this time, wouldn't it be telling the people who set up the formation that they had already discovered the abnormality, and that they could activate the formation? The Tao Master's disciples were obviously aware of Luo Fan's approach, and for a moment, they all shifted their attention from Luo Fan to the third senior brother. The third senior brother was naturally unhappy to be stared at with so many suspicious eyes. However, he also knew that this was natural. After all, didn't he also suspect that his original body had given up on him? Even he himself was suspicious of his original body, so wasn't it normal for the other Tao Master's disciples to suspect him? I don't know either. If any of you have avatars outside, maybe you can contact them, the third senior brother said lightly. Hearing this, many Tao Master's disciples' eyes showed a flash of understanding. Then, there was fear in their eyes. As the third senior brother had said, these Tao Master's disciples were obviously disciples of those Tao Masters who had left their doppelgangers in the outside world. These Tao Masters each had their own cultivation, and many of them could not be abandoned. Under such circumstances, they naturally had a number of doppelgangers to replace them in their own cultivation. However, it was obvious that even the third senior brother, who was the strongest existence among the many Tao Master's disciples, couldn't contact their original body, so how could they contact their avatars? Their expressions changed. Obviously, they found that the connection between their avatars and their original body had been completely cut off. My connection with my avatar has been cut off, a Tao Master's disciple said with an ugly expression. Mine too. Another Tao Master's disciple said the same. Then, more and more Tao Master's disciples said the same thing. Each one of them was indicating that they could no longer contact their original body or avatar. In such a situation, all the Tao Master's disciples knew that there was a conspiracy. They clearly knew that the third senior brother was also a projection of his avatar. Could he contact his original body? Whether he could contact his original body or not meant whether the third senior brother was behind this matter or not. If it was the third senior brother, he naturally couldn't completely cut off the connection between himself and his original body. At this time, he must be able to bypass the formation to contact his original body. If he couldn't contact his original body, it was very likely that the formation was not arranged by him, and it was very likely that it was a conspiracy of another existence. At this time, the third senior brother said directly, "There's no need to look. My connection with my original body has also been cut off." As he spoke, bursts of light shone from his body, and various kinds of inexplicable fluctuations were released from his body. They began to stir the void, and he seemed to have turned into a phantom. Seeing this phantom, the expressions of many Tao Master's disciples changed slightly, and each of them became even more ugly. Obviously, the third senior brother was using his own method to completely expose the connection between himself and the outside world. As for whether there was a connection between himself and his original body, the Tao Master's disciples would know at a glance. This method of completely exposing one's connection with the outside world was not too complicated, and Luo Fan knew it at a glance. But at this moment, when the third senior brother in front of him displayed it, he did not think of such a use. He could not help but secretly praise in his heart, as expected of a disciple of a Tao Master. The perfection of the inheritance is really not something an ordinary independent cultivator can compare with. I wonder what on earth you guys have discussed? Luo Fan said at this time with a smile. Hearing his words, the expressions of many Tao Master's disciples changed slightly, and they seemed to be faintly ashamed. For them, this matter was obviously that they, the Tao Master's disciples, had lost face in front of the individual cultivators. After all, an existence that had the means to completely banish them was obviously a disciple of the Tao Master. In other words, this unforeseen event in front of Luo Fan was obviously an internal conflict between the Tao Master's disciples. How could this not make the Tao Master's disciples, who thought that they were extremely united, feel ashamed? However, compared to their shame, Luo Fan did not care. There were so many Tao Master's disciples, even in the hundreds of millions, and each of them had their own independent thoughts, standpoints, and ideas. With so many of them, how could they really be completely united? It was really normal for there to be some conflict. We are confused because we are too concerned. What do you think? The third senior brother actually asked Luo Fan at this time. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and then he smiled and said, "Isn't it very obvious? Isn't it just besieging the enemy and attacking the reinforcements? Their target may not be us, but your real body." Hearing this, the third senior brother's expression changed greatly. He really did not think of this possibility before. However, at this time, after being reminded by Luo Fan, he realized that this possibility was really very likely. He was also the third senior brother. Although it was only a doppelganger projection, his thinking and thoughts were very similar. He was very clear about the thoughts of his real body. If his real body suddenly felt that the connection between him and the doppelganger projection was cut off, how would he react? He would definitely rush over to see what was happening here. It was not because his real body attached great importance to this doppelganger projection, but because the doppelganger projection suddenly cut off the connection, which made him have to pay attention to it. The connection between the doppelganger and the real body was extremely close. Now that it was suddenly cut off, if it was due to natural factors, it meant that there was a wonderful thing here that could cut off the connection between the doppelganger and the real body. For a cultivator who was dedicated to cultivation, it was naturally worth a trip. But if it was not a natural factor, but a man-made factor, it meant that there was a change that might have a great impact here, and could even disrupt the whole third level of the Tao Master's path. No matter what it was, as the third senior brother, his real body would definitely come to check it out. If it was really as the cultivator in front of him said, that they besieged the place to attack the reinforcements, then his real body was really in danger. Seeing the change of the third senior brother's expression, the expressions of the other Tao masters also changed slightly. Obviously, they all understood that the third senior brother had confirmed the existence of this possibility. Who the hell is it? How dare they do this? A Tao master's disciple shouted angrily at this time. At this time, Luo Fan looked quite calm, and he was not worried about being locked up and about to be exiled. After all, for him, cultivation was cultivation no matter where he was. Even if he was exiled to the individual cultivator's area, he would still cultivate as he should. Under such circumstances, what impact would being exiled have on him? Even the worst outcome would not affect him, so what else was there for him to worry about? Seems like I have to think of a way to warn the main body. At this moment, third senior brother's clone projection muttered. His eyes swept around, and suddenly his eyes lit up. He said to Luo Fan, "Being exiled is not a good thing for you, right? Although the impact is not great, it is indeed not a good thing." Luo Fan smiled slightly and said faintly. At this time, the other Tao master's disciples were thoughtful, and some even showed a sudden realization, as if they had already thought of something. The third senior brother completely ignored Luo Fan's nonchalant words and said faintly, "In this case, we can say that we are now in the same position. Cooperation is the only way out for us." Luo Fan nodded. In this regard, there was no need to argue. What was the point of arguing when people with discerning eyes could see it? "So, what do you plan to do, fellow Taoist?" Luo Fan asked. "Right now, we still don't know who the opponent is, but it is nothing more than a few aspects. First of all, the most likely one is a schemer under some Tao master who wants to take this opportunity to seize the position of the third senior brother. Secondly, it is a higher-level Tao master who intends to subdue me to complete a certain plan that I will never agree with." The third senior brother's words were actually quite orderly. "I have no interest in the conspiracy between you Tao masters. Fellow Taoist, let's talk about how to cooperate," Luo Fan said faintly. He could analyze these things if he wanted to, so he naturally had no interest in listening to the third senior brother. "Fellow Taoist, your concept God power has now grown to a point where it is almost completed. We can help you perfect this God power, and what you need to do is to break this formation when the God power is completed," the third senior brother said. When Luo Fan heard this, he was slightly stunned and said, "Aren't I already getting your help to complete the God power?" The third senior brother sneered and said, "That is only what you think, fellow Taoist. In fact, other than adjusting the God power to a certain extent under our resistance, what else did you gain? What about the source of your God power? What about the mental cultivation method of the God power? What about the development prospects of the God power? Have you obtained all of these?" Hearing this, Luo Fan felt as if he was struck by lightning. In an instant, he felt that a whole new world had opened up in front of him. The concept God power actually contained such content. Didn't this mean that what he was doing before was just taking an unconventional path, and it could even be said that he only obtained the superficial knowledge of the concept God power? Origin, mental cultivation method, development. He murmured as his eyes flickered with light. It was as if there was a limitless amount of wisdom appearing in his heart. "That's right. What do you think the concept God power is? It's just a combination of power and concept? If that's the case, why do we need to cultivate the concept God power so hard?" the third senior brother said calmly. Hearing this, Luo Fan kept nodding and said, "Indeed, indeed. Looks like I was wrong. For cultivators like them, all methods only had one goal, and that was to improve their cultivation realm and increase the possibility of reaching Tao. Under such circumstances, all of their cultivation had to advance towards this goal. And according to the concept God power that Luo Fan thought before, how could it help to improve one's cultivation realm? It was simply a sublimation of the concept method. Even if it was raised to the highest level, It would only allow one's concept and worldview to unleash greater power. Even if the increase in power was unimaginably large, it was only a method of application. What use was it for the improvement of one's concept, the perfection of one's worldview, and the improvement of one's cultivation realm? As for the benefits that Luo Fan had obtained from it before, the growth of his perception and the strengthening of his worldview, it was actually only caused by the deepening of his perspective. Fundamentally speaking, it was still him, and it had nothing to do with the perception magical ability itself. Chapter 2105. Since you agree, let's get started. The third senior brother did not waste any more time and immediately said. It wasn't that he wasn't cautious enough, and it wasn't that the perception god art wasn't precious. It was because he knew very well that time was running out. Who knew when the conspirator would do something and banish them from this area? If they were one step slower because of the delay, it would cause the entire area to be banished, and it would be troublesome to make up for it. The eyes of many Tao masters were filled with unwillingness at this time, but none of them dared to refute the third senior brother's decision. They were unwilling because the essence of the divine power of perception was so precious that they naturally did not want to impart it to a rogue cultivator. However, things had developed to this point. If they did not want to be banished, then there was only one choice. What could they do, even if they were unwilling? Naturally, Luo Fan could not ask for more. He immediately said, "Then let's get started. Show me how mysterious the divine power of perception is." The third senior brother was very bold. Since he had already made a decision, there was no longer any hesitation. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved it in the void. In an instant, a divine power of perception emerged from his hand and turned into a long river, rushing straight towards Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan felt the uniqueness of this divine power of perception. This divine power of perception was different from all the divine power of perception that the third senior brother and the other Tao masters had displayed over the years. It was not that its power was stronger than other divine power of perception, but because this divine power was not concealed at all. Its internal structure, the combination of its power, and the interaction between its concept and power were all presented without reservation. No matter who it was, as long as they focused their perception on it, they would naturally be able to see everything. As for the combination of power, Luo Fan was not very interested. Because through these years of probing, he was already able to form an even more exquisite and profound combination of energy for his concept of indestructibility, and he was able to utilize the concept of indestructibility to erupt with might that even surpassed this concept divine ability. However, as for the deep interaction between perception and power contained within, it was as if a new world had opened up in front of him. His eyes instantly emitted a light that could penetrate through time and space. All of his attention was completely focused on the divine ability of perception and the subtle interaction between power and perception that existed within it. So that's how it is. So that's how it is. As expected of a Tao master. After a long time, he murmured and casually slapped his hand, directly dispersing the perception god ability that was already in front of him. At this moment, his mind was filled with countless thoughts, and the flames of his thoughts were constantly flickering. All kinds of mysterious information kept emerging from the depths of his mind. At this moment, the subtle structure of the concept of indestructibility was constantly being adjusted in his mind. A type of power that had never been involved in before was gradually added to the concept of indestructibility. The essence and foundation of the concept of indestructibility was this almost insignificant part of the entire concept of indestructibility. The combination of the concept of indestructibility and the concept of indestructibility produced unimaginable power. It was enough to make a certain concept of indestructibility millions of times more powerful than its original power. This was the surface mystery of the concept of indestructibility. As long as one mastered this, It meant that one's use of concept had already reached a certain peak, and it was enough to transform one's concept of indestructibility into powerful strength. However, if one mastered this, it would be equivalent to only knowing how to use a gun. At most, it would only be able to increase one's strength, but the effect on one's cultivation realm would be negligible. In contrast, if one mastered what Luo Fan had comprehended, the reaction between power and the concept of indestructibility would be equivalent to turning the power of a gun into the driving force for one's evolution. Every bit of enhancement of the concept of indestructibility would mean one's growth and sublimation. The reason for this was very simple. Although the reaction between power and concept of indestructibility was negligible in the concept of indestructibility, the existence of this point completely opened up the channel for the growth of the concept of indestructibility. This allowed the concept of indestructibility to constantly be tempered and improved, and it would constantly absorb all the mysteries it came into contact with to make itself grow. In this way, there might not be any effect in a short period of time, but as long as there was an abnormality, the concept would definitely grow to an unimaginable height along with the concept of indestructibility. Just like at this moment, when Luo Fan's indestructible concept hadn't comprehended this crucial point, the relationship between it and the concept of indestructibility was just the relationship between two parts of a dead object. However, after he comprehended this crucial point, the relationship between the two had already become the relationship between the roots and the branches and leaves. As the roots continued to grow and dig deeper, they would absorb more and more nutrients for the growth of the branches and leaves. As the branches and leaves grew, they would also absorb more and more nutrients for the roots to continuously extend, spread, and dig deeper. It could be said that at this moment the two had truly become one. The progress of the two could finally be truly synchronized. It was obviously not an easy task to perfect the reaction of power on one's perception. Even if Luo Fan were to do it, it would not be possible to accomplish it in one go. Now, although he had comprehended that crucial point and had begun to consciously make such adjustments, when he adjusted to the limit that he could reach, the reaction effect of power on concept was still quite insignificant. At the very least, compared to the concept of third senior brother, it was more than 1,000,000 times worse. However, even so, he could already feel his cultivation realm rising bit by bit, as if it had been boosted by a booster. His worldview also began to gradually change during this process. An unknown amount of mysterious information began to spread through the indestructible concept and continuously integrated into his worldview, making it more and more perfect. Because that element in the indestructible concept ability hadn't been adjusted to the most perfect level, the effect of this improvement couldn't be seen for the time being. But one could imagine that if this continued for a long time, this worldview would definitely grow tremendously. This is the perfect concept God art. After doing all this, he let out a long sigh. His face was filled with satisfaction. As expected, what I obtained before was only the surface. The true concept God art is indeed not that simple. As he thought that, his indestructible concept God art began to squirm on its own, and the various combinations of power within it began to adjust accordingly. The speed of these adjustments was not too fast, but from the beginning to the end, it only took a few dozen breaths of time. After a few dozen breaths of time, when the structure of the indestructible concept God art had truly been adjusted, the entire God art gave off a feeling that it had suddenly become several times stronger. In fact, on top of the indestructible concept God art, there was an additional feeling of a God art that was not present before. This change seems so inconceivable, but it was actually very natural. Once a mechanical creation was constructed, it would naturally be difficult for it to adjust itself and become more perfect. However, a living thing was different. Once it was born, it would begin to adjust itself according to the environment, and in the end, it would reach the point where it could perfectly adapt to the environment. Before this, Luo Fan's indestructible concept God Art was a mechanical creation. All the combinations of power, the combination of concept and power, were constructed bit by him. However, it was different now. Now, in the indestructible concept God Art, the combination of concept and power had reached an unimaginable level, and it had truly turned into a living thing. After it appeared, it would naturally start to adjust the unnatural parts of its body according to the environment, the minute loopholes, and the minute inconsistencies with the environment. Just like that, the change from before appeared. "Looks like you have succeeded," the third senior brother said with a somewhat complicated expression at this moment. Although he wanted to give some guidance to Luo Fan, he did not expect that Luo Fan could actually complete the adjustment of the indestructible concept God Art so quickly. According to his expectations, it should have taken at least a few years of closed-door training to achieve this step. Unexpectedly, such a transformation was completed in just a few breaths of time. "The God Art he has obtained is more advanced than I imagined. I wonder which fellow Taoists spread this God Art." Such a thought flashed through his mind at this moment. However, he still did not expect that this God Art was created by Luo Fan himself. He only thought that it was some kind of inheritance that he had obtained. The previous guidance to Luo Fan was just to help him grasp the key points when cultivating this God Art. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Although it's only the initial stage, it can indeed be considered a success." Hearing this, the expressions of the other Tao masters became more and more complicated at this moment. However, this was not the focus at this time, so the complicated expressions of the Tao master's disciples did not last long. Soon, a Tao master's disciple said, "That's so fast, fellow Taoist, are you confident that you can break the formation? I have to try to find out. However, I think it shouldn't be a big problem." Luo Fan was still smiling. His words made many of the Tao master's disciples frown, but also somewhat happy. The third senior brother said, "Then let's begin. Let us see the results of your cultivation." Luo Fan did not stand on ceremony. Although being exiled would not affect him too much, he naturally would not feel too happy because he had been schemed against after all. Now that there was a chance to break the other party's plot and save himself from being exiled, he had to seize it no matter what. Immediately, he lightly shouted and instantly manipulated the immortal concept divine ability to disperse the seal on the many Tao masters' disciples. Soon after, the world began to tremble and collapse with a bang. It turned into endless streams of light that began to shoot in all directions toward the place where he could sense the disciples of the Tao paragons. This process was so fast that it surpassed the speed of time. Before the heavens and earth had completely collapsed, the numerous streams of light had already reached their destination and bombarded the defenses of the Tao master's disciples. For a time, the world shook, and endless rumbling sounds rang out in the void. God knows how many almost perfect worlds completely collapsed at this moment, and the surrounding space within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles turned into paste at this moment. Space-time, rules, and Dharma all became extremely chaotic. "Oh no, we've been discovered!" Exclamations began to break out from everywhere. "Hurry up and activate the formation!" Loud roars began to appear from nowhere and spread over a radius of hundreds of millions of miles, so that all living beings here, including Luo Fan and the others, could clearly hear the sound. "It all depends on this step," the third senior brother thought at this moment. Whether they could break this formation or not depended on whether the other party could still activate it. In other words, it depended on whether the divine ability Luo Fan released could continue to destroy their arrangements. If Luo Fan's divine ability had been divided into so many parts, even if he had absolute control over everything, when facing the many Tao Masters' disciples, the speed of each part would inevitably be slowed down by their power. That was to say, if it had reached this step before, the immortal concept divine ability would inevitably be a step slower to condense to resist their attacks. But obviously it was not the same as before. Now, the divine ability itself seemed to have turned into objects, and its instinctive reaction had even exceeded the control of Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, even if it was divided into so many parts, its reaction speed would not be slowed down at all. But it stuck to the many Tao Master's disciples like sticky candy, and began to constantly destroy their power, their divine abilities, and all their means, so that most of the Tao Master's disciples could not activate the part of the formation they controlled and could not be exiled. Damn it! At this time, an angry roar came from above the void. This angry roar was full of majesty and contained strong anger. The moment it came down, countless runes naturally evolved into fists in the void, blasting at the nodes of the formation, that was, the place where the many Tao Master's disciples were located. Finally, at this time, the third senior brother shouted angrily. With this angry roar, his body rushed into the sky, emitting dazzling silver light from all over his body. Suddenly, it condensed into countless sharp blades and soared into the sky. As if transcending time and space, it directly came to the place where the many fists fell and bombarded with the many fists. Earth-shattering roars and terrifying shock waves all flashed at this moment, spreading far and wide, stirring up the surrounding area, which had become extremely chaotic under the divine ability of Luo Fan's immortal concept divine ability, into even more chaos. And taking advantage of this opportunity, the other Tao Master's disciples had already rushed into the sky, turned into rays of light, and scattered in all directions. All along the way, they poured out their perception divine abilities without holding back in the slightest. They bombarded the nodes of the formation, bombarded the surrounding space, and forcefully opened up a path of blood. They wanted to leave this area enveloped by the formation and escape. Don't even think about escaping. My plan has not been completed. How can I let you escape? At this time, the angry roar turned into countless fists again. Then, an incomparably huge figure emerged in the void. This figure was a middle-aged man. He was tall and slender, and his body was extremely round. His face seemed to be shining with the light of a treasure, giving him a holy appearance. The light shining from his eyes was filled with an unwavering determination. It was as if even if other living beings opposed his decision, they would not be able to change his mind. This middle-aged man's figure filled the sky and the earth. Just the size of his head was already hundreds of millions of miles in radius. If it wasn't for the fact that the people here were all at an extremely high level of cultivation, with extremely strong eyesight and unbelievably powerful senses, just seeing his full appearance would have been a great problem. Who are you? I have never seen you before. At this time, the third senior brother shouted lightly. At this moment, his figure also began to expand wildly, and in the blink of an eye, it had already expanded to the size of the huge figure. Facing the figure from afar, the two of them were like the two poles of heaven and earth, and their existence had already fixed this part of the world. Not only were the two of them extremely astonishing in size, but the aura emitted from their bodies was also extremely powerful beyond imagination. At this moment, their auras intertwined and clashed with each other. The surrounding space and time seemed to have turned into a newspaper during this process. It was violently stirred and extremely distorted. The chaos that was slowly calming down became more and more chaotic under their auras. After the chaos reached its peak, an indescribable order was established. This order was that with the two of them as the center, and with the center as the dividing line, both sides showed completely different sceneries. Although the two sceneries were equally chaotic, the feeling they gave off was completely different. Chapter 2106. Luo Fan was in between the two, at the border of their auras. His figure did not change at all. Compared to the gigantic figure, he seemed so tiny and insignificant. However, for some reason, whether it was the third senior brother or the conspirator who had just appeared, they could not ignore his existence. It was as if this tiny body contained a great power that surpassed even their own. "I'm just a lone cultivator, I shouldn't have anything to do with your fight, right?" Luo Fan said calmly. His voice was rather calm, but when it spread out, it instantly suppressed the chaos caused by the collision of the third senior brother and the conspirators' auras. It caused all the movements in the surroundings to instantly calm down a little. Both the third senior brother and the conspirators' expressions changed when they heard this. "Could it be that you want to settle the score later?" the conspirator asked calmly. If it was an ordinary lone cultivator, he naturally wouldn't care and would just casually wipe him away. But as someone who watched everything unfold, he knew very well that the formation he set up was destroyed by this lone cultivator. If it wasn't for this lone cultivator, although he might not have succeeded, he would definitely be able to hold on until his scheme was truly activated. Under such circumstances, how could he not care about this lone cultivator? How could he ignore the possible attack of this lone cultivator? As for the anger of his scheme being destroyed, he naturally felt it. But as someone with ambitions and pursuits, this anger wasn't enough to affect his mentality. It wasn't enough for him to directly focus on dealing with Luo Fan. At this moment, he was more willing to face the situation where Luo Fan left directly. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Actually, in terms of benefits, I might need to thank you. If it wasn't for you, it might have been very difficult for me to obtain the true essence of the concept God art." "But?" the conspirator asked calmly. "But from an emotional point of view, I was set up by the conspiracy, so I naturally can't feel any gratitude towards you," Luo Fan said faintly. His body shook slightly and an indescribable wave spread out from his body, instantly calming all the chaos in the surroundings. In the blink of an eye, the chaotic area caused by the two of them had completely returned to its original state. There was no longer any abnormality, as if nothing had happened. Even the third senior brother was slightly dumbfounded by such a method, and he was unable to comprehend the changes before his eyes. "How is this possible? What kind of divine ability is this?" he murmured. He had confronted Luo Fan for such a long time. Although he did not fully understand Luo Fan's strength, he had some idea of the limits of his means. Before this, Luo Fan obviously didn't have the ability to easily suppress all the chaos caused by their auras. Since it couldn't have been there before, but it was there now, the result was obvious. It must have been caused by some kind of change. There was only one reason for this change, and that was, he had imparted the true essence of the concept God art to the other party. Impossible! Although the true essence is extremely beneficial to the growth of the concept God art, it can't be that great. What's more, he's not using the concept divine power from before. Instantly, he rejected his previous guess. Although he rejected it, he still felt inexplicably uneasy. He vaguely understood that perhaps the other party's change was really because of him. At this moment, he felt inexplicably complicated. Naturally, he did not expect that the concept God art that Luo Fan performed just now was created by him. By imparting the true essence to Luo Fan, it was equivalent to opening the door to a whole new world for Luo Fan, allowing Luo Fan to benefit countless times more than he imagined. At this moment, the method that Luo Fan performed was just a small technique that he naturally combined his concept and power. This small technique was not the real concept God art, but it already had the true essence of the concept God art. It had the characteristic of the interaction between power and concept. Because of this characteristic, the wave in front of him naturally changed itself according to the state of the surrounding void. The wave naturally changed to the state that was most suitable to suppress the chaos and reconstruct the void. In this way, he could easily eliminate the chaos in the surroundings, which normally required an incomparably powerful force to suppress and stabilize it. However, he clearly did not have the mood to explain this to the third senior brother. At this moment, he only asked the third senior brother, You still can't contact the main body, right? The third senior brother naturally nodded and said, That's right, there's still a layer of communication between me and the main body. I can sense that the main body is rushing over here, but the main body can't sense me. Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, Then, now we can only defeat the conspirator in front of us to end everything. At this moment there was a roar in the distance. Then, the disciples of the Tao Masters flew back at a speed even faster than before. It was as if there was something outside that they were extremely afraid of intercepting them. At this moment, the third senior brother frowned and his perceptions swept over. In an instant, he grasped all kinds of things that they had encountered. In an instant, his expression could not help but change greatly. I didn't expect there to be another formation. How cautious! He sneered and said to the conspirator. However, at this moment, there were endless flames constantly surging from the outside world and shrinking inwards. These flames were extremely powerful. In the process of burning in the void, they naturally ignited the void, ignited the Dharma, and ignited everything that was almost perfect in the void. With the change, the flames continued to evaporate, becoming more and more powerful and terrifying. Some of the disciples of the Tao Masters did not believe it and rushed into the flames, trying to break them and escape from the battlefield. However, in the end, they were completely ignited by the flames. It was as if they were nothing more than dry firewood to begin with. No matter what means those disciples of the Tao Masters used, even if they used divine sense to protect themselves and resist the flames from the outside world, they could not slow down the flames at all. The flames would spread however they wanted to, however they wanted to spread, however they wanted to spread. With such a strange change, it was no wonder that the disciples of the Tao Masters fled in such a panic. It should be known that for the disciples of the Tao Masters, their biggest reliance was the divine sense. Now that even the divine sense could not stop the flames, their confidence was greatly impacted. For a moment they did not know how to react and could only retreat. Luo Fan stood there quietly with an inexplicable expression on his face, but there was a strong sense of curiosity in his heart. What a wonderful flame! It seems to have completely burned the connection between the concept and the power. With a glance, he already had a guess about the flames. However, this was only a guess. As for the specifics, he needed to observe further before he could be sure. At that moment, he did not hesitate and made a grabbing motion. An invisible palm instantly penetrated the boundless space and directly arrived in front of the flames. It reached into the flames, and with a grab, a large ball of flames was wrapped up. With a slight contraction, it was already in front of him. At this time, he did not use the divine sense, but the purest divine sense of immortality. Sure enough, as he expected, although the flames were very wonderful, they had no effect on the pure divine sense of immortality. The ball of flames, wrapped by the divine sense of immortality, constantly attacked the divine sense and tried its best to burn it. It wanted to break through the barrier of the divine sense and ignite the divine sense of immortality. But in the end, the flame was like plasticine in the divine sense of immortality. It could not resist at all and was casually kneaded and deformed. How is this possible? This thought flashed through the third senior brother's mind. He clearly felt that the flame could not even be resisted by the divine sense of immortality. How could it be so soft in the other party's hand, as if it was ordinary plasticine? However, he was the third senior brother after all, so his thinking speed was very fast. Soon, he understood what was going on. He hurriedly sent a voice transmission to the disciples of the Tao Masters and began to remind them. When the disciples of the Tao Masters heard this, they were all very surprised. Some of the bolder ones turned around and tried it, only to find that, as the third senior brother had said, the flame had no effect on the pure divine sense. For a moment they were ashamed and angry. They were ashamed that they had not thought of such an obvious fact at all. In the end, they had to rely on the third senior brother's reminder to find out. And they were angry that the conspirator had used such a method to plot against them. They had made a fool of themselves. This was simply unforgivable. However, even though they had reacted, it was already too late. At this time, they had been forced into the area with a radius of tens of thousands of miles. Within the flames, figures began to appear one after another. These were all the disciples of the Tao Masters. However, for all the disciples of the Tao Masters inside, they were all completely unfamiliar with the Tao Masters' disciples. The disciples of the Tao Masters were all related to each other, even if they had no friendship with each other. However, the identity of being the disciples of the Tao Masters was enough for them to recognize each other and remember each other. Therefore, it was not surprising that one or two people would see the disciples of the Tao Masters they had never seen before. However, if a large number of disciples of the Tao Masters did not see a disciple of a Tao Master that no one knew, then there was obviously a problem. At this time, the third senior brother asked, "Have any of you seen these people?" Clearly, he was already suspicious of the disciples of these Tao sovereigns. The third senior brother's question was obviously not answered. Among all the disciples of the Tao Masters who were surrounded here, none of them had seen the disciples of the Tao Masters who were surrounding them. The conspirator frowned and said, "Don't think about it, you haven't seen us before." As he spoke, his body slowly shrank. After a while, he had already shrunk to the size of an ordinary person. He stood in front of the flames and looked at the third senior brother and the others. "How is it possible? I have seen all the disciples of the Tao Masters in this world, and you are definitely not among them," the third senior brother said. As the third senior brother who controlled the third level of the Tao Master's path, he was qualified to say this. After all, in order to be recognized as the third senior brother by all the disciples of the Tao Masters in this world, he naturally had to see all of them. Even if he had only seen a large number of them, it was still a meeting. For an existence at the level of the third senior brother, as long as he had seen them, it would inevitably leave a trace in his heart. As long as he thought about it, he could remember it. So, the conspirator laughed at this time. There was an indescribable evil interest in his expression. "So, you are from a higher level. All of you." The third senior brother's words seemed to come from the depths of hell, containing an indescribable coldness. Coming down from a higher level of the Tao Master's path was going against the Tao Master's path. For the Tao Master's path, this was the biggest crime. This was obviously the most unforgivable thing for the disciples who thought that the Tao Master's path belonged to them. Even if it was an individual cultivator who made this mistake, they would do everything possible to force them into the Tao Master's prison, not to mention that it was the disciples of other Tao Masters who made this mistake. At this moment, the feeling of betrayal they felt was even stronger than when the conspirator had used the array to trap them and plot against them. Ha ha! As expected of the third senior brother, it's really not that easy to subdue the existence of a level. The conspirator suddenly laughed. So that's how it is. The divine sense of perception is really mysterious. At this time, a voice suddenly came into the ears of all the disciples of the Tao Masters present, causing them to be slightly stunned. They turned their eyes and found that the individual cultivator who had been studying the flame was now full of smiles and his expression was full of joy. Then, while they were dumbfounded, the individual cultivator suddenly burst into flames and began to quickly spread all over his body. In the blink of an eye, he had already been wrapped in flames. These flames were extremely miraculous. After they appeared, they immediately ignited the surrounding spacetime, ignited the surrounding laws, and spread wildly in all directions. In the blink of an eye, his surroundings had turned into a vast and boundless sea of fire. Although the conspirator's expression did not change, the pupils in his eyes rapidly shrank and seemed to turn into a needle tip in the blink of an eye. After a while, he turned his head and asked the third senior brother, "Where did you find this monster?" The third senior brother naturally could not answer, but his heart was also full of shock. If he answered, his words would be no different from the conspirators. That flame was condensed from a formation that the conspirator had obtained through countless means. This kind of flame was so powerful that apart from the purest thoughts, there was almost nothing it could not burn. Even the divine ability of perception could not resist the burning of this kind of flame. One could imagine the extent of its power. When the individual cultivator studied the flame and seemed to want to find out some secret, he was full of disdain and wanted to see the disappointed look of the other party after his failure. But he did not expect that after a few words, the other party had completely mastered the flame. Even the power of the flame created by the other party seemed to be more powerful than the flame that he condensed with the help of the formation and the help of many disciples of the Tao Masters. How could he not be shocked? How could he not think that Luo Fan was an incomprehensible monster? "Come on, as long as you can withstand this move of mine, everything before will be written off," Luo Fan said to the conspirator with a smile. At this moment, his heart was full of excitement. The flame seemed to be the natural enemy of the divine sense of perception. It seemed that it could even ignite the divine sense of perception and turn it into a part of its power. But in fact, its essence was actually a divine sense of perception. However, the structure of this divine sense of perception was different from all the divine sense of perception that Luo Fan had seen before. In the structure of other normal divine sense of perception, the combination of power and concept tended to be stable and subtle. However, the flame in front of him was different. Within it, the combination of concept and quantity was as violent as it could be, as unstable as it could be. It was because of this instability and violence that the divine sense of perception had an unimaginable assimilation effect. Chapter 2107. The conspirator and the third senior brother had the same feeling at this time, which was that they couldn't believe it. For the conspirator, this kind of flame was made with the help of the formation formed by many Tao Masters. He knew very well how difficult it was to make it. How could he not be in disbelief that someone could replicate the flame in front of him in such a short period of time, and even innovate to create an even more amazing and powerful flame? For the third senior brother, although he didn't know how the flame was made, the power of the flame was enough to make him understand that it was absolutely not easier to condense such a flame than to cultivate any divine sense of concept. Normally, even if it was a Tao Master, it would take tens of thousands of years to cultivate a divine sense of concept. Under such circumstances, how could he suppress his disbelief when he saw that the rogue cultivator was able to create such an amazing flame without any cultivation method? Even if he had seen the unimaginable deeds of Luo Fan before, he couldn't help but feel incredulous. Naturally, Luo Fan didn't care about their incredulity. At this time, he controlled the flame with great ease and began to quickly spread towards the conspirator, quickly wrapping the conspirator in the flame to strangle him. The conspirator himself was able to defend against the flames created by his own array formation, but he might not necessarily be able to withstand the flames created by Luo Fan. After all, the core of the two ideas were different, of course. Even if he couldn't withstand the flame created by Luo Fan, it didn't mean that he would be directly enveloped by the flame and become a part of it. Instead, he would inevitably be greatly hindered, such as being hindered by an extremely pure idea. Even if the core of the idea was different, the principle of the flame itself was still the same. For the absolute pure idea itself, the flame couldn't release all its power after all. That was to say, if the other party used a pure idea to resist the flame must first break the idea before it could hurt the other party. Obviously, the only way to break the idea was to use the same idea. However, obviously, even if he knew this, the conspirator had no interest in being wrapped by the flame to try to resist. At this time, he quickly retreated, and at the same time, the monstrous flame behind him rushed towards the flame that spread out from Luo Fan's body. The two suddenly collided, producing an earth-shattering roar that could never appear in a normal intertwining flame. At this moment, an indescribable black light from the point of contact between the two kinds of flames began to burst out in all directions. The incomparably astonishing shock wave spread wildly, directly dispersing the surrounding flames and destroying the surrounding spacetime. It even caused a certain degree of chaos in the laws and laws, causing an unknown number of flame phantoms to appear in the void. Then, under the stirring of the shock wave, these phantoms rapidly disappeared. Under such a change, the expressions of the disciples of the Tao Masters inside the flame changed, their bodies trembled violently, and they couldn't help but keep retreating, as they wanted to stay away from the area of the collision. There were even some disciples of the Tao Masters who couldn't withstand the impact, and a part of their body exploded. This scene was so tragic that the conspirator and the third senior brother couldn't help but change their expressions. Even the conspirator had never seen such a similar but different kind of flame confronting each other. This earth-shattering scene instantly made him more aware of the characteristics of the flame. Since the disciples of the Tao Masters inside the flame had such a tragic performance, the disciples of the Tao Masters outside the flame weren't much better. At this time, they also suffered from the powerful shock wave, and their own ideas couldn't help but tremble under the impact of the shock wave. This trembling was transmitted to their bodies, and naturally caused their life origin to tremble. They had to retreat away from the source of the shock to avoid the more powerful shock wave. In this way, the two sides that were originally facing each other from afar naturally separated. The disciples of the Tao Masters outside the flame gathered around the third senior brother, and were extremely vigilant in defending the surroundings. The disciples of the Tao Master in the flames naturally retreated tens of thousands of miles, directly making way for the flames that spread out from Luo Fan's body to wreak havoc. In just a short period of time, this place had already been divided into 3 layers. The conspirator's flame was 1 layer, Luo Fan's flame was 1 layer, and the third senior brother and the disciples of the Tao Masters around him were another layer. Not bad. Can you feel the body now? Luo Fan said to the third senior brother with a smile. Hearing this, the third senior brother sensed slightly, and then he frowned and said, "No. The isolation effect is still there." Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but nod and said, "It seems that we have to completely destroy the formation." As he spoke, he no longer hesitated. With a thought, the flames that spread around his body began to quickly condense, forming countless fire divine dragons in the void. They rushed towards the opposite flame, and brazenly poured into it, stirring the flame crazily. In the process, they quickly rushed towards the core of the formation in the depths of the flame, which was the disciples of the Tao Masters. As mentioned before, the collision of the flames would cause earth-shattering turbulence. At this time, so many fire divine dragons violently poured into the flame. The turbulence was so strong that it even made people feel as if the whole world was trembling and heading towards destruction. Endless shock waves were stimulated inside the flame, and even transmitted out through the flame, directly turning the surrounding spacetime into paste, causing it to suddenly fall into a state of chaos. At this time, the conspirators shouted, "Fellow Taoism, do you really want to go against us? Of course, I'm not the kind of person who can pretend that nothing has happened after being schemed against," Luo Fan just said lightly. As he spoke, the flames on his body continued to condense into fire dragons, constantly rushing out and pouring into the flame condensed by the formation. Each fire dragon he made was different from the other fire dragons in color, and the nature of each fire dragon was also different from that of the other fire dragons. This difference caused a lot of trouble for the conspirator. Every time he found the nature of the fire dragon in front of him and found a way to minimize the impact of the impact, the nature of the next fire dragon would completely change, turning into a completely different form, making all his previous efforts go up in smoke. This happened again and again, and the conspirator's expression became more and more unsightly. There is no deep hatred between us, fellow Taoism. If the means just now affect fellow Taoism, I can apologize, the conspirator said at this time. This kind of words of admitting defeat was already very surprising from the mouth of a Tao master's disciple, but it was even more awkward from the conspirator, who could even fight against the third senior brother and plot against the third senior brother. Not only did the conspirator feel awkward, but also Luo Fan could not help but feel a little awkward after hearing it. It seems that my action is quite effective. At this time, Luo Fan said with a smile. The conspirator actually said what he would not have said even if he was beaten to death, which meant that at this time, Luo Fan's action had already caused him trouble. If he did not say these words, the result would inevitably be many times more serious than the awkwardness caused by saying these words. After knowing this, there was no need to say more about what choice he would make. At that moment, he urged the fire dragons to attack the formation even more forcefully and approached the disciples of the Tao Masters. At this time, the disciples of the Tao Masters could only keep retreating, dodging, and constantly condensing the power of the formation to resist the attacks of the fire dragons. After all, they were the disciples of the Tao Masters, and this formation was, after all, set up by the disciples of the Tao Masters. Naturally, such a formation could not be like the ordinary formation in the secular world. Once it was set up, it could not be moved at all. At this time, even if the disciples of the Tao Masters kept dodging and fighting in the formation, it did not affect the integrity of the formation at all. The formation was still as perfect as before, and the flames in it were still as violent and powerful as before. Under their control, they carried out an extremely fierce fight with the fire dragons. This kind of fight released a more powerful momentum than the previous simple collision of flames, and more terrifying shock waves were constantly released in the process, constantly stirring the surrounding spacetime, pushing the originally glue-like area into a more chaotic scene. Are you going to work for them just because of this little bit of displeasure? The conspirator finally could not help but shout. His own strength was strong enough. If it was a normal fight, even if he was not sure that he could absolutely defeat Luo Fan, he would not be so aggrieved and could only run for his life. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he had to maintain this formation. The existence of this formation was extremely important to his plan and his conspiracy. However, he would rather tire himself out like this than watch this formation be destroyed. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's behavior seemed to be pestering him while he was still there, which was particularly annoying. Work for me? Fighting against fellow Taoist isn't life-threatening for me. Therefore, the so-called work for you is naturally not valid. Moreover, my current purpose is not to help them, but to see you fail, Luo Fan said lightly. As he spoke, the speed of the fire dragons emerging from his body became faster and faster. If he was a disciple of the Tao Master, even if he understood the method of creating this kind of flame, he would not be able to do what he was doing now and create so many kinds of flames. Only someone like him, who was considered to be the opposite of the path of cultivation by the Tao Master, could have so many ideas to create so many kinds of flames, and it was precisely this characteristic that made the flames he created particularly difficult to deal with. The conspirator became more and more uncomfortable while running for his life, and the accumulated anger in his heart became more and more intense. At a certain moment, when the fire dragons were about to penetrate the entire flame formation, the conspirator finally could not suppress the anger in his heart and burst out brazenly when he saw that he could no longer stop it. He shouted, "You deserve to die!" As he shouted, the entire flame formation completely collapsed in an instant. Endless flames instantly collapsed and condensed into a huge fist, which quickly blasted towards Luo Fan. This explosion directly passed through the place where the numerous fire dragons that Luo Fan had previously sent out were located, and directly crushed these fire dragons, turning them into countless sparks that splashed in all directions. The whole process was extremely smooth, and the fist did not have any delay at all. It still rushed towards Luo Fan at a faster speed. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that the entire third level of the Tao Master's road seemed to be pressing down on him. The incomparably strong pressure acted on him, making it difficult for him to breathe. What kind of existence was the third level of the Tao Master's road? It was not just a part of the world. Here, there was an almost perfect heaven and earth within every substance. Such a whole world was crushing down on him. The strength of that kind of pressure could not even be described with the word weight. It was no wonder that Luo Fan was affected by such a terrible pressure at this time. Even Luo Fan himself was affected, and the chaos caused by the impact of the flames around him was also greatly affected. At this moment, even though the flaming fist had yet to come into contact, the glue-like chaos seemed to have been completely frozen. Everything came to a standstill, maintaining an incomparably chaotic state as it froze there. Such a scene made the third senior brother's expression change greatly. Even his body needed a long time to prepare for such an ability, but now the conspirator had done it so easily. He instantly had a better understanding of the conspirator's strength. However, as his expression changed greatly, a kind of joy emerged in his heart. It turned out that the moment the huge flame formation was completely broken, the connection between him and his body had been re-established. In other words, the conspirator's plan had completely failed at this time. At this moment, he made a prompt decision to send everything that had happened here, all his speculations, and the speculations of other Tao Masters through the connection, to his body. As the information was transmitted, he had already felt that his body had stopped. It was no longer rushing here from its original location. Obviously, this change was also felt by the conspirator. At this time, the anger in his eyes suddenly increased several times. Then, with a loud shout, endless light flew out of his body and turned into a divine sense in the void. Accompanied by the huge flame fist, the divine sense quickly rushed towards Luo Fan. At this time, a kind of indestructible aura came out of Luo Fan's body. Then, a huge figure came out of his body. In an instant, it had already completely isolated all kinds of pressure in the void, so that Luo Fan could completely relax at this moment. This figure was none other than Luo Fan's divine sense of indestructible. This divine sense of indestructible had undergone great changes after its previous transformation. Every time it existed, it could improve Luo Fan's divine sense of indestructible. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally could not dissipate this divine sense of indestructible. Instead, he directly maintained it and pressed it directly in his body. It was his choice that allowed him to use this divine sense of indestructible at this time so easily and isolate the terrifying pressure brought by the flame fist. Then, the divine sense of indestructible shook slightly, and suddenly produced an indestructible seal, which suddenly slapped towards the huge flame fist. With this slap, endless flames appeared in front of it, wrapped in a huge palm print, and blasted towards the huge flame fist. This flame was none other than the divine sense flame that Luo Fan had previously created by observing the conspirators' formation. However, compared to the original divine sense flame, which could only be used as the core, he had now directly used the power of the divine sense of indestructible to create this divine sense flame. As long as he knew the principle, as long as he understood the truth, even if it was an impossible combination, it would become natural for Luo Fan. The conflict between the divine sense flame and the divine sense of indestructible was naturally nothing to him. All of this seemed to take a long time, but in reality, the entire process was less than a billionth of a second. In just a billionth of a second, Luo Fan's flaming palm had already clashed with the flame fist. The power contained in the palm was insignificant compared to the power of the flame fist. The disparity between the two was simply like the distance between heaven and earth. However, at this moment, the result of the contact between the two was different from the difference in strength between the two. In an instant, the palm wrapped in flames easily penetrated into the depths of the fist and slammed into a mysterious spot within the depths of the fist. With this slap, the flaming fist shook violently and exploded.